Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorin and Loco versus Worlds. And our guest for this one is going to be Jatt. And obviously, in line with the TSM Jatt meme, he's obviously representing North America, where he is casted for many, many seasons now, and was formerly a pro player, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you call it that, back in 2012 for Dignitas, who went to Worlds that year, actually, after I stopped playing for the team.
Yes. No connection there. Also, obviously, Season 1
connection.
championship. No, exactly. So, here's the thing, Jatt. This is something actually I wanted to address at the beginning is, as people who saw the Chinese episode, we're going to try and fill in some of the historical aspects here and like tie in year to year to year each of the worlds so people have a sense of like how a region's progressed and evolved, etc. Right? It's obviously a tricky one with what do you do with the Season 1 championship? I mean, I always make this point, and I've noticed this is the part that seems weird. People think I'm trying to like downplay the Season 1 championship when I say it wasn't a world championship. But first of all, it literally wasn't called a world championship because, we didn't conceive of a global scene in the same way back then. But the reason why I do that personally...
Wait, didn't they call it the Season 1 World Championship?
It was just called the Season 1 Championship. Because remember, back then it was just the season aspect, It was like, here's the ladder, and then we get to the end of the season.
EU, one team from Philippines and one team from Singapore. That's what...
But the reason why I always do that personally is just because if you were dividing them up, Season 2, as different as the meta was, because it is a world championship and has the whole global scene, is closer to the other ones than Season 1 is to the others, if you know what I mean. So to me, it's more just like, it was still, to some degree, the world championship. You just didn't have servers in those regions. These were the teams that had it. So basically, that's a long-winded way of asking, what do you think of, do you have anything that we should address for NA at the Season 1 championship before we get into the worlds that people are familiar with? Is there anything about the region or what the situation was back then?
I mean, people thought NA was the best back then,
yes.
In NA at least, but they weren't because Fnatic won. And if you're going to give Fnatic a world title, you also have to give NA a semifinal because
exactly
technically
that's a cost people don't always weigh up, right?
But I would say that like esports wasn't esports the way we remember it now back then. Like there wasn't a single team that I would actually classify as a professional team in the Season 1 World Championship by today's standards. Literally everyone was playing from their bedrooms. And for a lot of the teams, the first time they even met each other was at the Season 1 World Championship. So it was definitely representative of the best teams in the world at the time.
Yes.
But the game hadn't reached the two most dominant esports regions that we have now, which is China and Korea. So it very much was like, it was honestly almost like Rift Rivals was today, just like an extended version of Rift Rivals. It was a super entertaining tournament at the time, but like it just follows a different standard than what you're granting a team with today. There was like one qualifier that truly seeded into it to even find the three teams from each. I remember,
and it was an online qualifier.
Yeah, Dignitas was like super close to making it in against Epic Gamer, who was a team with like Doublelift and Dyrus on it.
And then.
Yeah, they like literally made that team basically for the qualifier, right? Whereas now you have like academy teams and qualifying in and people signing like 16-year-olds and waiting until they're eligible to play. They didn't even have like, I feel like real age requirements back then. So a completely different world. But I think because it still was in 2011 the best team in the world, I think it was a world championship. It's just like, it's not really comparable.
Well, maybe one thing we could address on that before we move on to the other worlds and the region generally is, I guess, one theme that does carry over from that is, since NA, definitely to the Western audience, is the most viewed and obviously has, depending on what period of history, big infrastructure, a lot of interest surrounding it, people's question will always be why NA didn't perform so well at a tournament. So in this particular instance, as you said, NA actually was considered to be the best region at the time. Obviously, teams like CLG were the best in the world. Then you had this tournament where, as we say, it was Fnatic who actually, and against all authorities, it was the two European big names that actually were able to get to the final. So the question would be this. Is there something to do with how NA read the meta that actually does connect to Season 1? Because wasn't this like the big shock, right? Was that NA sort of had a different view on or paradigm of how the game was played, which, based on the results at least, wasn't matched up with what the Europeans had done?
Yeah, back then, NA thought that double bruiser bot was actually the best way to play the game. Tarek Garen was considered like the shit. That's what you wanted to play bottom lane.
Sunfire Garen.
Yeah, and you just like both build Sunfire capes and then you win late game or mid game or whatever. But then the European teams were actually running AD carry support and they smashed. And I
It was
think
called EU Meta because we
Yeah.
just call it Meta, but it was literally called EU Meta because only Europe people did it, and NA thought their meta of Double Bruiser was better than EU.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of nostalgic stuff back then from even pre-World Championship when I think about, because I was like a really high elo player at the time. I was in the qualifier with like a team that I used to play with in Guild Wars, so like literally like gold players and then like a few people that were good, and we were like the 7th best team in North America. But you'd read forum posts about like the top picks in Europe, and then you'd compare them to the top picks in EU, or sorry, in NA, and they were actually different. Europe knew Malphite was good before everyone else. They knew AD carry support was good before everyone else. And it was proven at the World Championship, I feel like, that they knew the better meta.
Okay, because one of the other aspects, we didn't do it as much for the Chinese episode because actually, funnily enough, there are so many misconceptions and people just don't know the background of China that I actually thought just having like each of the big names that went to Worlds introduced kind of described some of the different qualities of the region. But maybe we could talk about this before we get into the specifics then, because I feel like that as an outsider, someone who obviously isn't from NA and actually wasn't originally from League of Legends, that does seem to be a theme to me, that each of the World Championships, one of the discussions is like, what is NA's read on the meta? Like, what is their understanding of the best way to play? And so in different eras, people have accused NA of just copying Korea, or maybe Europe. Often, if you'll notice a theme that tended to happen would, many of the world championships coming in, the Europeans would be considered to be behind the global meta somehow, but then they would inexplicably have a good performance. And so I remember there was an infamous quote from a Doublelift interview, which I thought was a great line, actually, where he said something like, I think it was after Season 3 Worlds, he said something like, even though he actually did think the European meta was worse, his theory was, it's more like you just play to your own strengths better than thinking like there's a total global meta and, we all copy that. So has NA had a trend in this sense?
I mean, I'm trying to think through all the world championships, and when you like lump the teams together, it gets a little murky. I would say that is often one of the reasons or excuses given after the fact, is that like in Season 3 they didn't know that Kassadin was good or something, or in Season 1 they didn't know AD carry support was good. But I think that's a tough one to say. You could probably draw like a small trend line there, though.
Okay, what do you think, Loco?
Well, I mean, NA always walks in really confidently, and
I think that's been one of their issues when I was like thinking back.
When you lose, right, it's very easy to blame picks. Picks are something incredibly easy to blame because it's something you can change like that, right? Oh, we just picked the wrong picks, wrong meta. So, NA has a tendency to do that, and also, when you get smashed, it's really, it's the same line of it, but it's really easy to be like, oh, they're picking better champions. Let's pick the ones that they're picking. And then you do worse on those champions. And then you arrive at the conclusion, oh, we're actually worse even with the OP champions. So it's a usual line of thought for NA. Walk in confident, lose, blame picks. Yeah, I mean, it's it's a cycle every year.
Okay. And so before we dive into like, we'll go Season 2 and go on, and then eventually obviously we'll have a whole section about this Worlds. Loco, for people who aren't actually aware, because I know some people aren't aware of this aspect, is they know about you when you were in Korea and when you were playing with Mick Frost, and then later coming to CLG and then becoming a coach at TSM. But obviously in Season 1 you were also playing in NA as a region. So can you give us some insight on that?
So I've spoken English ever since 3rd grade, and NA servers came out before Korean servers, and I was playing League as like a casual game. And because I played Dota before, I climbed extremely quickly. And my very first team was TSM. That's why I'm so very partial to TSM. I was one of the founding players,
We all are in this chat. We're all fans of TSM.
Yeah, TSM Jatt, TSM Thorin.
Especially Thorin. Yeah, I think
exactly.
Thorin, especially with all those.
It's just a slow burner for me. Yeah.
Like you two are really on the same level.
Yeah,
it's a hate-love thing.
Thorin talks about TSM more than I do. So yeah, I mean, I was one of the founding players for TSM, and I would have played in Season 1 Worlds, but there's this guy named Matt Marcoux, and then he's like, unless you have a citizenship or you live there. I was like, okay, citizenship or live there, so like, the rules are really weird, but I couldn't play, so I left TSM, and they picked up Rayman. Yeah, so I used to be on TSM at the very start.
Wait, were you going to play in the qualifier with them?
Yeah, I was, but...
Really? Who took your place instead? This is... This is news.
I think when I was leaving, also a lot of people were leaving. Like Feedfest was also leaving. I was leaving, and then they brought in like Odd One. Who else did they bring in? They might have brought in Faint right after me, and then Faint left to CLG. This is like 8 years ago.
Yeah, teams weren't really teams back then, but
Yeah.
okay.
There was no contracts. It was just.
Do you want to play? Yeah, dude, let's go.
And then it was honor among thieves. Like, but if a better team asks you, if CLG asked you to be part of their team, then bye TSM. Sure. Some players did that. I didn't. TSM for life, baby.
Okay, so if we start now into, as I said, when it was the World Championship, and people at least might in their mind have some memory of Season 2 Championship, right? The Season 2 Championship obviously had that format which was run for the first few, where you got buys automatically through to the round of 8 if you were a number 1 seed, except obviously there were 5 regions, and ironically it was actually the Korean region that ended up drawing the short straw, and so the Azubu Frost team had to go into the group stage. So this was the Worlds, where if people remember, obviously TSM was representing the tournament since they'd won the regional and they were the dominant team in the region. Then you had CLG, who had that very interesting storyline where they were pretty good in the Western tournaments, like they were placing top 2, top 3, but then they'd been away in Korea trying to win OGN, which they'd obviously been unsuccessful with. And then the third team was Dignitas, who ended up sort of coming on strong as the season went on and really peaked coming into Worlds. So, Jatt, obviously the TSM storyline just ends, like I said, because they got the number 1 seed and they went into the round of 8 and actually ended up having to play another number 1 seed in Azubu Frost, who came out of the group. They basically had a Worlds that lasted 2 games long, and it was mired, unfortunately, by that whole scenario of like the Woong looking at the screen and the potential cheating aspects, or at least like unethical behavior. So as a result, I noticed in Season 2, I even did a whole article about this, people actually resigned TSM as though they weren't a good team, like that showed they didn't do anything at Worlds and all. But beyond that circumstances, who was Season 2 TSM, this team that won all those domestic lands? Who do you think they were as a team, and how would you describe them?
Yeah, so Season 2 was actually the year that TSM really became TSM, because I remember at the start of 2012 CLG was the most popular team in NA, and it wasn't until CLG went to Korea that TSM overtook them in popularity. TSM was the first team to do a gaming house in NA. There was no LCS in Season 2. They did what was called like a circuit, and they had circuit points. So they had tournaments in like New York at Comic-Con. There was like IPL 3 actually gave away circuit points that Dignitas won. That's when I was still playing.
MLG's IPLs.
Yeah, MLG's IPLs. And TSM actually became dominant like the longer that circuit ran on, and was the best team in North America based off that. And then with all your circuit points, they did essentially a regional qualifier in packs that qualified all 3 teams, and TSM won that. Dignitas actually finished second, and CLG won the 3rd place match. I think against Curse or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. But anyway, at the time, like TSM was popular because they were the only team in NA that had a gaming house, and they were all really popular streamers. So that was like the beginning of the NA popularity thing, because they were really one of the first teams to jump on hardcore streaming, but they also just practiced more than everyone else because they all lived in the same house. So that's one of the things that helped them.
What do you think made them? Oh, yeah, go on.
Also, they did a lot of vlogs. Like Andy wanted his team to be popular. Like they were all about writing guys, like doing content, like streaming, and like vlogging was really big. And I think that's one of the reasons they really blew up. We talk about like Rayman and Andy, like with Trash Can, like jumping into puddles still nowadays. A lot of TSM fans, like that I still remember, like talk about the vlogs a lot.
What do you think made TSM a good team?
All right, thinking back to then, I think they generally had just the best players in NA, and they were adaptive. So like, I'll give an example of this, of how TSM beat me, and also kind of like how simplistic compared to today that esports was. So in 2012 with Dignitas in IPL 3, it's like was Dignitas's first LAN that I played in. And one of the things that we did that other teams didn't is we had a much higher priority on Dragon. And the way we did that is when our bot lane hit level 6, we would gank bot with all 3 ultimates. And it didn't matter if we'd get a kill, because we were only doing it for pressure. And then we'd go take Dragon, and that's what Dragon was worth a bunch of gold, and we would like snowball the game slowly that way. And the whole way we did that is like I would have a very set jungle path that I would run, get an XP lead on the enemy jungler, so I'd hit 6 first, and our first gank would be bottom lane. And Odd1 was actually the only jungler in NA to like successfully counter jungle me, because he actually looked at the routes I was doing and figured out how to stop me. And a lot of other junglers like literally weren't doing that. So Odd1 was a better player. Reginald had a huge amount of pressure in the mid lane. I think it was still Rain Man in the top lane then, wasn't it? Yeah, Rain Man was actually one of their weaker players, to my memory. Once they got Dyrus, I thought they got a lot better. Was Dyrus on them in the season 2 championship?
I'm trying to
I feel
remember.
like he was. Yes. What
He
happened
did the
was,
pillow thing. He did the pillow thing, right? And pillow thing without Worlds.
Yeah,
the
Dyrus
key
made
thing
them
is,
a
you have
lot
to
better.
remember, because there was no LCS, like the whole season's part is a little bit more wacky, because like the off season between them, well, we don't have LCS, so it's not as easy to define. So when Jatt's talking about, which is actually the very end of 2011, the Rain Man was still on. And then if you remember, the last tournament the Rain Man had was that IEM World Championship where they really failed and they didn't get out of the group. And then that's when Dyrus joined and they
Dyrus
immediately won all the tournaments.
And as soon as they got Dyrus, they kind of lost their weakness, because they really did have like the best player in all 3 lanes and one of the smartest junglers in NA, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought they basically went off individual skill.
Well, I actually do think there is one other core part where other teams were a little bit more democratic, because Andy owned the team, and Andy has always been very bossy, to say negatively. Like, so they were very clear about how they were going to play, and Andy was a very dominant shot caller. So I think like shot calling back then was incredibly easy, but Andy just had the team on the same page, and people didn't argue, and they executed on one thing. And that's not something a lot of the other teams did, where it was a little bit more democratic and a little bit more arguing, but TSM would be like, do this, and then they just did it, right or wrong.
Yep.
Okay. Well, actually, I thought then, one thing I can add to this before we talk about one of the other teams then, is when I did my Reflections interview with Reginald, he had a very interesting answer to this sort of question, actually, when I asked him why was TSM so dominant in season 2. He actually, now whether or not he's painting like a really awesome narrative here, I don't know, but he actually says he doesn't think that they had the best players. Like, he actually thinks CLG had better players, like man for man, but his opinion was like it was like the culture and like the idea of like, you know, we follow one plan and we all work as a team, whereas to him, you know, the CLG squad was like, it was just disparate individuals, you know, and they kind of did whatever they wanted. And so I mean, the reason why I say I don't know if it was in like, I don't know if he's trying to be magnanimous now that it's years later, you know, and he's not playing. Plus, it also makes it sound actually a bit more baller, that it's like, oh no, you actually had better players, but you know what, we were just a better team, you know, so it makes it sound cooler, if you know what I mean, in a way.
Why did they have a better team? He's like, oh, because we had Reginald, right? Like that's
not a bad reason, right? Yeah.
From Andy's point of view, like especially in season 2, I can see why he would say CLG had a better team, because like CLG did have incredibly strong players from like preseason to season 1 to season 2. But I think more realistically, we can say they're even. I think it's unfair to CLG to say TSM was worse everywhere but Andy. Odd1 was definitely smart. X Special was very good. Dyrus was extremely solid. Like, there are definitely points where we can argue CLG were better, but I don't think TSM was this like underdog team with winning purely through shot calling. I think that would be a misrepresentation of the history.
Okay, right. Well, then what about this then? Since they were obviously the eternal rivals, let's talk about the CLG team. Now, for the sake of avoiding confusion, so as we did with the TSM example there, where we gave the timeline of, like, you know, they had the Rain Man and then Divers came in. Right, the way it went was, in Season 1, CLG was obviously the best team, and they had won a number of championships. And then you had the period after the World Championship where there were a bunch of IEMs, which is kind of the IPL period Jatt's talking about here, where again CLG won or did very highly, placing. And then what happened was they got that lineup in early 2012 where Doublelift came in as AD carry. And initially, they still had St. Vicious, and this was actually one of the lineups where they first went to Korea. And this was, for me, the lineup I think Reginald's talking about when he says, like, you know, they had the better players. Because this was where you had, like, Hotshot was still a good player. You had St. Vicious, obviously, was like a carry jungler. Big Fat LP was probably fallen off a bit. But, you know, obviously, he was like a legendary figure at that point in time. You had Doublelift, who was this mad breakout talent. And at the time, Chowster, when he was a support player, was very highly touted. But it was obviously a few months after that they had the triple swap between Curse and Dignitas and CLG, and out went St. Vicious, and then they got Voyboy to be the top laner, and Hotshot became the jungler, and that's the team that went to Worlds. So With all that set up, can you give us some insight into Season 2 CLG? Because like I said, there was really kind of two of them. You know, there was the one with St. Vicious, and then there's the perhaps ill-fated Hotshot GG Jungle. George in the Jungle, I believe it was named. Experiment, which, well, history will have to decide how that one worked out. So what do you think, Jatt? What was CLG of Season 2 like? Because there was a lot of adventures there.
Can I actually answer? Because I spent a lot of time with them at OGN.
Weren't you on the... Okay, you actually joined them after.
He joined after.
Yeah, we'll skip that part. We'll get to that part when we
Are
get
you sure? Okay.
But we'll talk about Season 2 CLG. So I remember them coming over into OGN. They were... CLG Season 2 were probably the cockiest NA has been. This including like all of like TSM during like Season 4, Season 5. But it was probably the cockiest team NA has ever fielded. When they initially came to Korea, they didn't want to scrim Korean teams because they felt like we'd be teaching Korean teams how to play. And then when they almost didn't make it out of groups, they started to want to scrim Korean teams. The team was super dysfunctional. Saint had his own idea of how he should play the game. Chowster had his own idea of how he should play the game. Double was just Chowster's sidekick at that point. Hard to believe, but Double was a sidekick kind of person. And he just listens to Chowster. George just wanted to win and like watch anime and play the other non-League of Legends games he likes to play and stream. So you had an owner that was passive. You had a really strong voice in Saint, a really strong voice in Chowster. And it was always this like struggle of what are we going to do? And like people consistently arguing. And then when they pushed the really strong voice in Saint away and they got Voyboy and George went into the jungle, like a lot of things were dysfunctional. Then now Chowster's voice became the strongest, but Chowster was very correct about certain things and very wrong about certain things. So they sometimes didn't function. And George in the jungle was no bueno. It was definitely not Hotshot's like strongest time as a player. So it was a lot of players that were extremely good in preseason and Season 1 staying together and slowly falling apart and egos clashing and like slowly breaking the team apart.
Yeah, I mean, I like that synopsis because also before, at least this is my experience playing like Guild Wars competitively, teams don't usually stick together for very long on internet games. Like it is so easy to switch teams as soon as you disagree with someone. Before I found like the team I ended up sticking with, I was probably on like 15 different teams in Guild Wars. And I feel like League of Legends was really the same way. So as soon as COG like tried to force 5 people to stick together without an actual strong authority in place. I mean, in the same way that Reginald was the authority figure for TSM, Hotshot was the authority figure for COG. So that's why he like probably went to the jungle, Loco.
Hotshot wasn't an authority figure. Hotshot was more of a legacy figure, and he was the owner. It was his team, but
yeah. So he gets like the de facto final say though, even if he doesn't really have a strong voice, which is like a weird dysfunctional dynamic. I agree with the fact that Doublelift and Chowster, especially when they went to Korea, thought they were the best, and a lot of people also thought they were the best bottom lane, and that Big Fat in the mid lane was super, super good at certain champions. Like there's a reason he was so dominant in solo queue, but that stuff just didn't transition when they started playing against more modern teams, is what I might start calling them now, which is like the Korean teams that actually had infrastructure and coaches and like someone putting together the roster with players and personalities that might actually mesh a little bit more together. So I think that's why they started to fail.
Okay. Because when you said there, Loco, like the Hotshot was a legacy player, for example. Like I remember that was one of the interesting things about this lineup, because since this was the first year where Doublelift was like, first of all, like a pure AD carry, and he had his chance on a big top team, people might, who know Doublelift now, think of the very extroverted person. The theory of him in the last few lanes he's been in is, you know, he got to lead the lane or have a lot of input in how it was played. But if everyone remembers, there was that infamous meme picture where it was like Chousted inside Doublelift's brain, like pulling all the levers, which was kind of how people saw it back then. And he would even say himself, you know, you basically whatever Chousted says, that's like the law. You just do whatever he says basically in the team.
Doublelift grew into the person he is now, like, which is very confident, which is very like leader, like knows what he wants, says what he like means. But back then, Doublelift was really timid. Hotshot, Chowster, and Saint were definitely the biggest voices on CLG, and Doublelift was, you guys might not believe it, but a very passive member and like there for the ride more than anything. he was very happy to be on CLG. Like, Double was a nobody, and then TSM CLG were the biggest teams, and Chowster, Thane, and like Hotshot were like untouchably big.
As you said though, Jatt, one of the key details here of the CLG squad, if we tie it all together and characterize them in season 2, is like, first of all, they didn't win because they went to OGN, they just went to the round of 8 each time and lost. Then they were back. Admittedly, they lost to the team that won the championship, so it might not be as bad as it sounds there. But then in North American competition, because they would fly back and they would play in the MLGs and the IPL, they lost them all to the team that was TSM. TSM won all those titles. But at the same time, they did believe they were the better team somehow. Like, they actually were quite cocky in that sense. And then probably I thought like the ultimate indignity was that, yes, at the regional, they didn't even come second. It was actually the Dignitas team who did. So then when you get to Worlds, people may remember they didn't get out of groups there. That was the Worlds where they had sort of their own version of the Expected backdoor. They played that game against, I think, like SK or something, right? And they had some wacky version of like their own version of that. So what do you think season 2 CLG was like?
I think Loco covered it pretty well. When I'm actually looking at this group now that they didn't make it out of, Azubu Frost, the team that won the tournament, Invictus Gaming, one of the best teams from China, COG and SK, like, by today's standards, that's actually not a group you would expect them to make it out of. But it's just we'd never had international competition. So they were, even though they were a dysfunctional team, because of what had happened previously in League of Legends and all the international tournaments basically being these NA versus EU, like IEMs randomly. And I think in season 2, there was this one Azubu Blaze tournament against TSM where
in New York,
like,
MLG something
smashed. It was MLG Face Off, I think, in New York. But anyway, they're just extremely confident, as I think every team was, because all they'd done in NA and EU was win, and Korea and China just hadn't had the game for as long. So they're like, how could they possibly be as good?
Oh,
so
do you remember that infamous line? Korea is 1 year late. They'll always be 1 year behind.
Who said that?
Yes.
Was it Double?
Lift. Yeah.
He says a lot of stuff. And by the way, like, all this stuff is like 5 or 6 years ago, and just my opinion on all those things.
Yeah.
So like, there's so many different ways that you could interpret this stuff. But
and to be fair, Doublelift was like an 18-year-old kid at the time who, it's not like he just finished learning the classics and Latin and stuff, you know. He's a very young man. He's still learning life and how to express himself. Okay, so what about...
We're living history. Like, where else are people going to look this stuff up? There isn't a history book. Unless you come and talk to people like me and Jatt who actually lived it, you can't find this kind of stuff anywhere.
Okay, so Loco, since you were there with them in Korea, and as you said, they were so cocky, and yet they never got the results in Korea that they imagined they were going to get, you know, like they thought they were going to win OGN.
Yeah.
What would your take be on why they didn't do well? Like, why didn't they win domestically? Why weren't they able to do well in OGN? Why weren't they able to go far at Worlds? Because they had some talent, right?
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. So, I mean, first of all, they were dysfunctional. They weren't a team. There were so many strong voices, and they didn't want to play as one. And they thought they were better. They weren't that open to learning, and like, they never even practiced that much when they were in OG. And they were like, I remember just them constantly arguing over and over again. And so after we made it out of groups, I think we were in Group A and they were in like Group D. I had a lot of time, so I went over and like hung out with them, and they practiced nowhere as much as us, and they were also having like hard time getting practice partners, and their practice partners weren't as good. Oh, I remember one other thing. They wanted to stream their scrims, so people didn't want to like scrim them. I'm extremely cocky, dysfunctional, like not very functional as a team. And also one thing that was like, to me, like, it was personally hurtful back then. We actually beat them before that tournament even happened. We beat them in OGN Invitational, and they considered that a fluke. They considered it a fluke that we beat them. So when they were coming to Korea for the second time, they were still cocky even after losing. So I'm not sure how that team was ever going to function.
Okay, so then the third team was the Dignitas squad we talked about before. And in contrast to the TSM squad, who was winning everything, and the CLG squad, who had legacy names and huge, Dignitas doesn't really have any of that because they didn't win the tournaments. They weren't the biggest names, but clearly they must have been a good team if they were able to get a number of results. Like oftentimes, actually, they were able to beat CLG in some of these Western tournaments we're talking about. Jatt, you were obviously a member of this team slightly before this period, and then they had their squad that went through Season 2. Who was the Dignitas squad? Right? We know them now, we know these names, but who was this squad, and what do you think what were their strengths if it wasn't just like the biggest names or the champions or whatever?
Right. So at Worlds, their roster ended up being Crumb's top lane, I Will Dominate in the jungle, Scar mid, I'm a Cutie Pie, and Patoy as the support. So this roster changed a lot.
Yes, because obviously, as I said, they were part of the triple trade where they'd had Void Boy earlier on, and I think at the time Crumbs was the jungler, right?
Yeah. To me, Scar and Cutie
Dominate
Pie,
rather was, yeah.
Yeah, to me, Scar and Cutie Pie were both like just insane mechanical players by North American standards at the time. Like I remember one of the reasons that I wanted to join Rock Solid, who was Dignitas at the time, is I thought Scar was the best laning mid laner in the league because I thought every matchup he'd be able to play to a CS advantage. I thought the same thing about Void Boy, and I was like, okay, if they can win top and mid lane, then with like shot calling, you can end up winning the game. And then after playing with Cutie, he was like the most frustrating player to play with, like competitively, because he was so good, but he didn't care like at all outwardly, and it was really hard to like find ways to get him to like practice the champions that you think are actually good or get team practice in. But basically after hearing some of the COG stories and talking to a lot of people, they were a more functional team than COG, even if they were slightly less talented from top to bottom. And looking at their group again, yes, they are 0-3, but if my memory is correct, it was just a best of one single round robin. So you literally only got to play everyone once. And they had already played Najin Sword, who was the Macnoon team from Korea, who's super good, and COG EU, who was the best. Well, arguably they had that giant rivalry with Moscow 5, but they were one of the two best Western teams at the tournament and nearly won OGN a couple months prior. So they were also super good. And Dignitas just lost to both those teams and then like kind of mailed in against Saigon Jokers because they were out anyway and ended up going 0-3.
Well, one thing, that was the infamous like Direst leaking strategy.
Yeah, that too. It's crazy how long you can talk about these currently irrelevant tournaments because I remember I was casting this tournament, right? So like during the prep, we had also heard about this like Dignitas strategy that I think only them and TSM knew about. And they were like, this is all we've been practicing. This is gonna revolutionize the way you play League of Legends. It was basically double jungle. It was basically jungle support, both clear jungle and then go to gank people.
Yes.
But it was leaked before the game. We didn't leak it. We knew about it. So as soon as it started happening in the cast, we're like, all right, this is what we've heard about. This is how it's going to work. And it didn't work. It didn't work at all.
It was blown out of proportion, I feel like. I think Dignitas like took it overly personally, and because Zyrus was a really nice, he still is a nice person, but he was younger and more naive back then, so he took it really personally that he leaked it, and then the story got blown out of proportion. It's where like Dyrus fucked over Dignitas, where it's more so like there was a small leak. Dignitas was probably going to lose anyway.
Yeah, because listen, if it really was a revolutionary strategy, that would have became the meta, right? Like, sure, I think they were internally tilted that the other team had wind of the strategy, but they still never would have practiced against it. Like if the strategy is actually
made it sound more
good,
like a cheese, didn't it? If you have to surprise the person with it as a one-off.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can definitely see if you were to go to more modern times, like Gigabyte Marines lane swapping against Fnatic last year. If someone had told them, like, by the way, they're going to lane swap this game, like, be ready, they'd probably lose that game. So there's a chance that Dig may have been able to pick up a game, but I think it's like a pretty slim chance. With like revisionist history going, and I don't think they deserve to get out of that group, whether or not Dyrus told people about the strategy.
As a way to wrap up the season 2 part, then, since this was one of NA's worst showings, like TSM was in the round of 8, but that was just from seeding, and then they lost. CLG and Dignitas didn't make it out of the groups. Is there a general theme as to where NA was like as a region at the time, or what would contribute to not really getting anything out of Worlds this time?
This is easier to say now. Because at the time, I don't think it was that evident to the people at the top of the scene. But in comparison, to the teams that were winning and good, NA was really under-practiced and really lazy. They played the game a lot, but they weren't like actively practicing,
Yes.
right? It was actually mostly about streaming, and you definitely try-harded for instances of scrims, and like that was the norm. And I think the norm started to change a little bit after season 2.
Sure. So like the difference between, like, they obviously played the scrims, but I mean actually it was an infamous rumor about TSM that they used to just purposely like troll in the scrim and then just see all your picks and everything you're doing and then just try and beat you in the tournament, you know. So that's very different from someone trying to actually practice and improve and, you know, work on something and the whole region get better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the TSM scrim thing is probably a little overblown. Like in the actual practice, I think it's somewhat smart strategy to like let the other team get their best stuff in scrims so you can learn how to play against it.
Sure.
That was like unbelievable tech at the time, and people just like blame TSM for throwing scrims and stuff. But that happens all the time now in pro scrims. Like we had not leaks. We had people talking last year about how like, oh man, TSM got criticized for tryharding in pick ban scrims and like giving away their best strats like a year ago. Scrims are constantly mind games. I don't feel like that was necessarily a problem back then.
Okay. Right, let's move into Season 3 then. And obviously Season 3 was the LCS era, which definitely makes it a lot easier because we're not talking about how people did it in like 9 different LAN tournaments.
Yep.
So there was the 2 splits, and if people remember, this is a key aspect, the system back then was basically the regional just was the playoffs of the summer split. So actually, technically, the spring split meant nothing except that you were in LCS. So you qualified by placing 1, 2, or 3 in the summer split. So the storyline for Season 3 was, even though when the LCS began, we obviously had the big 4, we had TSM, we had Dignitas, we had CLG, we had Curse, and then we had the other teams that made up the LCS back then, some of whom haven't survived to this day, some of whom you might know some of the players of, but they're not going to be that relevant. But the key thing was, when we come through to Worlds, obviously we still had TSM, slightly different because they kicked Chaos out, they got Wild Turtle. We still had... let me think, who was the third team for that one?
Vulcan.
Yes,
Vulcan.
We had the Vulcan team rise up. Yes,
Man-Cloud-led Vulcan.
Which ties into the theme of what I said about when the LCS began, because they were supposed to be one of the also-rans, you know, like we've got the big 4 and then these others are not going to do anything, but they obviously shocked everyone and finished well in the first split. Then they went to Worlds, and then we had the rise of Cloud9 coming up in the summer split, and then in theory becoming the best NA team. So who were the Season 3 teams, and was the LCS... Was there an impact on who the teams were and how good the region was, do you think, Jatt, for Season 3?
Yeah, I think LCS had a pretty big impact. The region was going to be, but also Cloud9 was just so much better than everyone else in LCS. They weren't a team until the summer split, but then they went 25-3 and then 5-0 in the playoffs. So they were 30-3 going in. So when you're comparing like we were super top heavy that year with Cloud9 being better than everyone. They had 4 of their players in the top 10 of Challenger pretty much the whole year. So they're the best solo queue team. They had the best pick ban prep of anyone in the North American LCS because, once again, this is going to sound really dumb in today's context, but they brought a notebook on stage. Like that's the Lemon Nation notebook. They had tier lists of champions. Like this is the best support. This is the second best support. This is the third best support. And they just draft off that. So it always seemed like they had a bunch of power picks in their team composition. And then they had a really good shot caller because they were high. So all the things that Loco and I were talking about, like issues in Season 2 that all these teams had that were fatal flaws, they don't have a clear shot caller, or, you know, they don't have good teamwork. Cloud9 actually had all those things. And they were the first North American team to do that. And they crushed. They almost never lost.
What do you think, Loco?
Jatt said it best. Like, C9 had great players that were hungry. So NA was in this problem of, we're not going to pick up new players because new players are bad. Old players are good. And TSM and especially CLG stuck to that. CLG were very, very hesitant to pick up new players.
Mm-hmm.
So C9 was like the first breakthrough NA team of completely new players that hadn't been on pro teams before, just like doing it right and just smashing people. I mean, I think Jatt said it pretty much. They didn't have any of the stupid fatal flaws that the Season 1, Season 2 teams did. And they had
So-
all the good parts that the other teams did, like Andy shot calling rivaled with high shot calling, CLG star players rivaled with C9 star players. Like they had everything.
So one of the aspects, again, referring to what I said about Season 2 Worlds, again, the number one seed from NA, so in this case Cloud9, automatically was in the quarterfinals, and they had the same problem, which is they just lost the first match, so we'd never actually got to see what Cloud9 would have been like. They basically played 3 games against Fnatic, 1-1, lost the infamous Don't Ban Kassadin game, and then that's it. So we kind of actually, I felt a bit like shortchanged on that one, because I wanted to know what would have happened if they'd have played against Gambit and, you know, OMG or SK, you know, there's all these other teams. So what would you speculate, Jatt? Obviously this was a very young team, as you say, they'd just played one split. If they'd have just been thrown in the mix, how do you think they would have done?
So this is a team that, like you say, I wish we had the modern Worlds format and we could have thrown them in a 4-team group and let them fast fail a little bit and then still maybe make it out, because getting into that really quick best of 3 quarterfinal against Fnatic, which I think the next year it went to best of 5 quarterfinals.
Yes.
Super punishing. And Fnatic was a really damn good team. They were 7-1 in the group stage back then, and that was a group with Gambit, Samsung Ozone, Vulcan. So it's hard to say that, like, oh man, they would have made a big run, but I think they would have been top 8. And if we had a best of 5 quarterfinal and we'd seen them be able to, like, actually work around the weakness that Fnatic identified in them, which was super good. Like they said, dude, Hai was only well practiced on like a small handful of champions. Let's ban him out and let Peke, our best player, like abuse that fact. And even with that known, the series still went 3 games. And I remember casting that series. It was actually really close for a couple of those games before it actually broke open. And on top of all that, a recurring failure of North America, C9 came into that tournament really arrogant. Like, and you can see why. Like, they were 30-3 and completely unchallenged. But I think because they didn't play in group stage, they didn't get to trip up. Like, we've seen so many other teams trip up in modern group stages and then still make a run later into the season. Mm-hmm. And their first trip just killed them.
I'll say one thing about that C9 team, that something that was special about them that no other NA team, I think still to this day, actually CLG at MSI did. They had a style that they felt like they were good at, and they didn't change it when they got to the tournament after watching other teams play something dramatically different. They had high on roaming, high pressure mids, media some farm, bot lane on utility, top lane on very heavy carry champions like Rumble, and they ran that style. And the only other time where an NA team did that, I feel like, was CLG at MSI, where they had a style they liked playing and they ran that style and they did well with it. So I actually think C9 would have done well. I actually don't think it would be.
Well, do you think if they would have played that style in group stage, because essentially, like, they didn't change, would they? I don't think they would have been capable of changing. Right?
I think that's the thing though. Like,
yeah,
NA teams, for some reason, they're good at something and then they go to Worlds or international tournament and they don't do it. They get like freaked out. They scrim and they either have they scrim and they change it up.
Do you think that's one of the aspects then? Because obviously a theme that we're going to bring out in some of the later Worlds which emerged was when that format came around, where there was week 1 and you play all the games on different days, and there's week 2 and you play them all on one day. Famously, NA has done very poorly on week 2. Is this something to do with it, Loco? Like, if they, after week 1, they overreact to something, or they see something that's strong and they try to just like switch up what they're doing?
I think the biggest problem NA has regarding picks is they can't come to logical conclusions, and they usually come to emotional conclusions about what happened. They had better picks, so we lost. Our picks are fine. We can just run them again. Like, a lot of times NA teams end up at a emotional reasoning of, or emotional, like,
justification.
Yeah, justification for the draft.
How do you think Korean teams do that better then? Right?
Coaches are like, this is bad, this is good, don't do this, do this. NA teams, the coaches say that, this is bad, this is good. No, this isn't bad for XYZ reasons. Like, you weren't there playing. Like, I promise you, like, if you played the same comp again, we would win. It's really tilting when you tell me we shouldn't play these champions. Like, NA players will say that, where Korean players are like, okay, let's do that. Okay, let's do that.
And then you actually get to run more tests, right?
So the things I quoted, like, it's really tilting that you tell us to not play this champion. I think it's really dumb that we should ban this champion. We practice this. Like, these are things that NA players have said to me personally before, and I know hearing just from other coaches that they've heard from their players. Like, it's a really common theme in NA where we usually like work around player feelings more so than what's just good.
Okay, so obviously one of the other teams was TSM, and they were the team that, as I said, they started out with the LCS with Chaos. They kicked him right towards the end of the split and brought in Wild Turtle, ended up winning the first split. Then Cloud9 comes along, but actually TSM had a good result of their own by actually beating Vulcan to even get to the second seed, because at the time Vulcan was actually also had a fantastic record, but just Cloud9's outshined, as it were. And then at Worlds, this TSM squad is one of Reginald's last big tournaments. Didn't manage to get out of the group stage, but to be fair, they were in a group that had SK Telecom, OMG, these are extremely good teams. So who do you think Season 3 TSM was, in contrast to, the Season 2 team, which had generally the same players?
Don't forget about the Lemon Dogs with Mithy in that group.
Yes, there was that team as well.
Mithy, Dexter, and
I'm just reading off Leaguepedia. It's like still such a good resource to have. Yeah, I mean, really apart from C9, none of the teams in NA were close to that level, and I think you ended up seeing that at Worlds. I think there was like one game on the analyst desk where I thought TSM would beat Lemon Dogs. Like that was the tricky thing in that group. But aside from that, like OMG and SKT were just worlds better, because sure, TSM switched out Chaos for Wild Turtle that year, but they didn't really change anything fundamental about their team from the previous year, in my opinion. They were still like just a more iteration of the team that was flawed in 2012. And that was like Reginald's last hurrah too. I think at a certain point, like him running the business and him being a world-class mid laner started conflicting more and more. And this was like, I think this was his final tournament before they brought in Bjergsen, or close to.
The only time he played again after was when Bjergsen had to go back for his visa, and he played a little deals.
Yep, agreed.
Yes. Okay, so then the third team was the now infamous Vulcan, mainly infamous because of what happened after this Worlds. But at this point in time, as I said, they were also a team that had risen up, and obviously in the summer split, they'd managed to become one of the best teams. Right, this is a team, actually, Jatt, that a lot of people watching this video might not be that familiar with. Like, some of the names probably are not household names. Even some of the ones like Smithy was there. But what's funny is I remember the hype around Smithy at the time was like, he's this mechanical beast, fucking insane jungler. It's like, that's really not how people think of modern day Smithy. If you think of the guy now in the Team Liquid squad. So who was Vulcan?
Oh my goodness, this is a throwback.
Start with Zuna.
Yeah, Zuna was Tristana player, and his brother was the coach, which led to some conflicts. Bloodwater was seen as this like shot calling support, but when I think back on this team and when they were successful in summer split, so much of it revolved around ManCloud. He actually, for a long time, held the record for most kills in an NALCS split until we switched to best of 3, and it's really easy, now to say that so much of that was Smithy, because Smithy actually was really good, and he's the only player to still really be relevant in the competitive scene. You'd say like, oh man, it was so clear back then that Smithy was really good. It's just you didn't realize him. I think partially that's true. Smithy did have a lot of good games, and a good jungler and mid laner are often like paired at the hip. So this is one of those teams that I think had better team play than most people, and at Worlds just didn't have the players. Hard to say though, like they're a blip really in like the overall NA story outside from seeing Smithy here.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Loco? I
mean, that team was also extremely cocky. Like Zuna and his brother, like, oh man, like when they beat Dignitas, I remember the interview being very like rude and savage towards Dignitas.
Yeah, I mean, Vulcan is this super weird team thinking back, because Smithy's really the only player that like still exists in the pro scene, and but is actually super good now, and it's easy to go back and say like, wow, he's always been that good, because so much of what this team was ManCloud. He had the kills record in NALCS before we went to best of 3, so I think he averaged like 7 kills a game in the summer split. It was something insane. And it's easy to go back and say like it was Smithy who enabled him, and if I were to go back and watch all those games, maybe that's how I'd see it now, because I think Xmithy was underrated for a really long time. But yeah, I think overall this team's like a blip on the overall NA history, because they were good enough to make it. I don't think they were there improperly or over someone that more deserved it, but I think you saw at Worlds that the team like just didn't have it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if you ask people back then, who are the players you know from Vulcan, Xmithy would actually not pop up. It would be Juna, the AD carry, Bloodwater, Maincloud, maybe Xmithy fourth. Like, he was just, maybe he was a big part of the team in terms of play-wise, but in terms of the team's image and like what people thought about them, it was a lot of Zuna and Maincloud. Zuna was very loud, very confident, very cocky, super trash talk, and Maincloud was extremely good.
So if we move to season 4, maybe we'll do it like this. I'll give the quick basic overview, because this was a very, very messy year, actually, because there's a lot of changes. So the spring split of season 4 was the one where Bjergsen entered the TSM roster. Odd One was still there, though, at that point in time, and famously they got to the final. They played Cloud9, so you had that final with Bjergsen there, and this was the one where actually like Hai was the MVP of this playoff run. Cloud9 won another title. It's like Bjergsen, maybe he hadn't quite adjusted yet to being like the superstar player of TSM. And then when we went to the summer split, Odd One went out. In came, at the time, Amazing, from coming over from Europe. And then we had this scenario where Special got kicked fairly early on, and initially they brought in Glebe, and then after that, since Loco had joined as the coach, he convinced his old teammate, organizational teammate, Lost Boy, to come over and join as a support. That split was very, very messy. I remember there was like a period in the middle of the split where I think there was like 6 teams were tied for first place or something outrageous, and obviously this was still when the league didn't have that many teams in it. So in the end, even the finals was very chaotic, because it was that 3-2 series against Cloud9, which was quite an epic match. Ended on basically one team fight. TSM wins the split. Cloud9 ends up coming second. Third place was when Voyboy's cursed team lost that epic 5-game series to the LMQ team, which was an all-Chinese team. So let's do this, okay? That's the basic overview. As you can see, there's a lot of ups and downs. In the spring split, actually, CLG had been very good. They'd fallen off towards the end. But coming into Worlds, so we'll ignore LMQ, just in as much as it was literally a 5-man Chinese roster. And if we're talking about Vulcan being a blip, they only played for one split and then they were gone after that. Some of them stayed around in tip, but it wasn't the same squad. So let's mainly just focus on TSM and Cloud9. And obviously, this is actually, aside from the joke Jatt made before that, like, if we count in season 1, technically NA did make semis. But aside from that, this was the best NA run at Worlds, because the two teams, Cloud9 and TSM, both got out of groups, both played in the quarterfinal. Sadly, both played Samsung teams that basically couldn't lose to anyone at this one. But So what would you say, Loco? Starting out, you were the coach of TSM at the time, so give us some insight into the season 4 TSM.
Well, I will say 2014 was an extremely competitive summer split. So I don't know how spring went because I wasn't there, but summer was super competitive. Curse was decent. CLG were good, and then they fell off. Cloud9 was good. LMQ was good. I mean, obviously TSM was good. It was a very, very competitive season, like NA overall, where it wasn't just clear cut who was going to win. Going into Worlds, what do you want me to say? Like, how strong you thought we were, or like going into Worlds, this was the first time TSM bootcamp, if I can remember, at Korea, because in season 3 it was hosted in NA. So there's no way they bootcamped. So in season 4. It was the first time we boot camp. It was actually a lot of fun. So this was the first time where Riot allowed teams to boot camp at the Riot Korean offices. So what we did was we all got like houses near Riot, and then we stayed in the houses, and we would come into Riot and practice at Riot. So we'd be able to scrim any of the European teams, because I mean they're just there. You go, hey guys, do you guys want to scrim? And we could scrim them. And we had really, really good connections to Korean teams, thanks to me and Lustboy. So we got to scream Samsung White, Samsung Blue, SKT. It was really great scrim environment, and we got to learn so much. And we got punished in ways we never did in NA. So I feel like the playing field leveled so much because of the boot camp, and Korean teams were willing to scrim the Western teams a lot more back then. And there was a lot of build-up leading up to Worlds in Korea, just boot camping. So, yeah, I mean, that's why I thought it was really competitive. NA was really strong going into the overall summer itself. and the boot camp was very helpful, and Korean teams were very open and willing to scrim NA teams compared to nowadays.
Okay. What do you actually think of the quality of the teams in Season 4 from NA, Jatt?
Definitely better than previous years. Like, we just went through, all the fatal flaws of the teams that went to Season 2 that were super arrogant, way too cocky, didn't practice enough. 2013, C9 was head and shoulders above everyone else. They got humbled a little bit, but then because LMQ came in and was a very competitive team with like good mechanical players, and because TSM brought in Bjergsen, brought in Lustboy, brought in Loco. I think Loco actually helped them a lot that year. But it leveled up NA, and I think you saw it in the results. What's interesting, looking back at the group stages, NA and EU were in the same group in all three groups, and this was the year that NA had two teams go through to quarters and EU had none. And like the narrative afterwards is that NA would just like, oh man, NA is so much better. But I really don't agree. Like I think this is a tournament where NA got fortunate results out of very close situation.
Yes.
I look at TSM in their group, and I know there was a disappointment that they lost. I think TSM could have gone farther if they didn't. Didn't you guys lose a game to SK?
Yes.
That you shouldn't have lost? Because SK had a suspended Svenskeren coming into that tournament, and that was also the non-Korean team group. So that's always like, not only was there no Korean team in that group, there was also a suspended player on the European team, and then Taipei Assassins was really weak that year. So that was golden road for TSM.
It's about the best group you could draw, basically.
So I will admit, we had a great group. We were in a situation where if we beat SK Gaming, we would go into a tiebreaker against Royal, and we prepped really hard for Royal, and we knew what we would do. And SK beat us when we did not think we were going to lose to SK, and we scrimmed a lot with Samsung White because we were both in the groups were split to Taiwan and Singapore, and we were both in the Taiwan group, and I had really good connections to Samsung White through their coach and also through Mata. So we were scrimming Samsung White exclusively through the group, and we talked to them, hey, once we make it out as first, and once you guys make it out as first, we can't meet each other. We should scrim even more. And they're like, yeah. So like the path was like lit from in front of us. We were like, okay, just beat SK, beat Royal, scrim Samsung White, beat whoever we meet in quarters, and then hope we don't meet Samsung White, and then maybe we can go to finals. So that's why everyone from that 2014 TSM thought we could go to finals, because we had it laid out. Like we planned, we had like the scrim partners ready too.
Step 1 is easier than step 2, and you didn't make it past step 1. So it's hard to say that we could have done it. Like, sure, you went 1-1 against Royal already, but you also went 1-1 against SK.
At the end of the day, results are results. It's really silly to talk about what if. I mean,
it could be fun, but sure.
I'm going to do that in 2016. I'm going to play the what if game in 2016, because that's where I feel like the what if is a lot stronger than 2014. Okay. But I love the what if game. It's one of my favorite games.
You know, the obvious downside to that plan, though, Loco, is that meant that when you met Samsung White in the quarterfinals, and that Samsung White team is very, very famous for like just being able to wreck everyone in scrims.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, if people remember the way that series went, they just literally it was probably the most disrespectful like playoff series you'll ever see in a World Championship, because they played as though they couldn't lose, basically, even from the draft.
Mm-hmm. That was the Samsung White style. They picked a lot of priority champions without having a lot of CC or a lot of tanks, and they ran a very, very tight macro game. Like, it seems super simple now. Win lane, get vision, take turrets, rotate, but it was extremely revolutionary back then, and they did it very cleanly, and they had a very good of it. Mata and Dandy were super on point about working together to get vision and pick people off.
Yeah, I actually disagree a little bit about like that series being this like throwaway for Samsung. The game 3 draft that they lost was, yes, a little bit of styling on TSM, but game 4 is actually pretty close in that series as well. I think TSM probably wins that series like 4-5 times out of 100, like very, very infrequently.
I thought you were going to say 5 times out of 10. I was smiling.
It really would be TSM, Jatt, if you said that.
Yeah.
That would be ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, Samsung was honestly like on another level back then. I know this is the NA show, and you guys are probably going to do a Korean one, but for so long it felt like that was like, in comparison to the competition, I feel like maybe the best team we've had. And that's always one of those hard things. It's like comparing box office numbers to inflation. And because of how well they macroed, like as Loco mentioned, so many other teams were like, okay, you need to have like this level of initiation and like this tank and these damage dealers. But like Samsung didn't need that to win. They just needed to be able to pressure. They pressured the map and they controlled vision in a way that was so much better than anyone else had ever done. The teams like just had no chance, is what it felt like.
Okay, so on the other side, we had the Cloud9 team who had a very interesting group of their own because they actually got what on paper was a pretty tough group because they got the European Champions Alliance, and then they had the Najin Shield team who had made it through the regional, and then famously they ended up in a tiebreaker with the Najin team anyway to see who went in first, but it could have been a three-way tiebreaker because they'd gone 1-1 with the Alliance team, but obviously Alliance got kaboomed, and then as a result, it just ended up being who came first place, basically. Now, the interesting thing here, Jatt, is obviously it's never quite the same, but in a way we did get to run the experiment we wanted to run at Season 3 Worlds and throw them in there with a bunch of different teams and see how they did.
Yeah, and I think this was a slightly evolved version of C9, like Meteos, a different way than he did in Season 3. High, after having the collapsed lung, I think never came back as exactly the same player. But I still think, sorry, Loco, I think Cloud9 was probably the best NA team at Worlds in 2014. How did scrims go against them back in 2014?
We try to not scrim them much as possible because it's like, not that they were bad, but we wanted to learn and we wanted to experience different things. Can I ask why you thought they were better?
Well, I think they were in a harder group situation and proved more in the group. Like they won 1 to Alliance, they won 1 Najin. You guys won 1 Starhorn and 1 SK. I think those were like. It's hard to say now with the way like Starhorn went all the way through to the finals, but the group stage Royal I thought was different than the group stage Najin. Being in a group with a Korean team, being in a group with the #1 seed from EU, and then still pulling out the win in the clutch against Najin, on top of the fact
beating a Korean team was a big deal back then.
It was a massive deal back then. They also lost in the tiebreak, so they were 1-2 against them overall. And the fact that the final was decided over a single team fight, right? Like you guys were neck and neck the whole year in NA, I felt like. So Worlds, you both kind of went in with a clean slate.
Okay. We don't have to make this show about Cloud9 versus TSM in 2014. That'd be a lot of.
Really want to see, yeah.
Okay.
But I'll disagree, but let's move on.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's move to Season 5 now, and Season 5 is when we had, again, actually some up and down results. This is when it wasn't just as clear cut. So in Season 5 Spring was when we had the same final we'd been watching for a while now, which is TSM versus Cloud9, but TSM won this one. This was when TSM had the really strong run of form where they won the IEM. They came back and won the split back domestically. MSI didn't happen. I don't think they went that year, right, Loco? That never happened. So
MSI never happened.
Yeah, there was no MSI that year. And then they went into at the time, obviously Cloud9 was still very good. They went into the summer split, and this was where obviously Cloud9 did not do very well because they brought in Incarnation, now known as Jensen, and then they booted out Meteos at one point in time, and then High came in as the jungler, who wasn't really a jungler in some way, and then they did that amazing run through the gauntlet and got to Worlds. And then the other team from this region was obviously CLG, who comes back into the story out of the darkness, the shadow comes CLG and actually wins the LCS for the first time, 3-0 TSM, and goes to Worlds. Now, obviously at Worlds, we had some very different results here. Only Cloud9 got out their group. What do you think of the Season 5?
No.
Yeah?
No one got out of their group. D9 went 3-0, and
yes,
that was
apologies.
The infamous...
Yes, this was the 0-10 group, second week, right? Yes, you're right. So
yeah, this was the 0-10. This was the week 1 was great. Week 1 was fine.
Yeah, was looking good. So okay, how would we characterize this one? Because obviously Season 4 is the one people remembered. As you said, people took that and really tried to drive it of like, NA was better than Europe. It was so clear cut. Even though I kind of agree with you, Jatt. If you look at like the groups people were in, there's a lot more like intangibles there that people maybe don't look at. But Season 5 obviously was probably the worst ever for NA. What would you put this down to? I mean, one piece of context I'm already thinking we should mention is this was the very weird Worlds in terms of like it was the one that had all those like permabans you had to do, like Mordekaiser, Gangplank. What was the other one? There was like another one as well. Maybe Lulu or something. I can't remember.
So this was the Worlds where Fiora, Darius, Mordekaiser, Gangplank all got. This was the big bruiser rework like a month ago before Worlds. So we played on a completely different patch where these champions weren't remade to all qualify for Worlds. And then Worlds was on this patch with all those things changed. And also the format was completely new. So it used to be you would play your groups like one by one, like a group would finish and then a group would finish and a group would finish. Now it would be you play all the teams once and then you get a break and then you played all the teams again. And there was like a huge break. That was the whole week 1, week 2 thing. So World format changed and the patch completely changed.
Yeah, the number of games you played in Worlds was exactly the same, but the way in which you played them was different. Because for the first week, you would play 1 game a day on 3 or 4 days, and in the last week, you would play 3 games a day on 1 day to close out your group. Previous year, it had been like groups A and D would play in a week, and then C and A, or whatever the one I didn't say, would play in the next week. But to answer your NA question, like, so 2014 is a year where I feel like so many things broke right for NA. The fact that TSM was in the group without a Korean team and SK had the suspension, and the fact that it was pretty good with like the infusion of Lustboy, Bjergsen, and Loco. Like C9 still had all that momentum from like 2013 when they were good. This year, TSM was on their last legs, is what it felt like after getting 3-0'd by CLG in the final. They had been like getting carried by Bjergsen for a while. The Juggernaut meta came in, which made it the very top focus NA meta, and Dyrus was in his retirement run, basically, so ready to give up the game. CLG, the best team in the league, had visa issues with Xmithy, so like any boot camp they wanted to have in Korea was drastically different because they had Pobelter and Huhi as 2 mid laners. They actually almost went into Worlds with Huhi as their jungler.
Oh yeah.
Like that's crazy. Like that's incredibly impactful behind the scenes, but you're never going to be able to judge that when you get there. And then C9 was actually 3-0 on the first week miraculously because I think they boot camped really well, and they actually came in with a better meta than a lot of other people did. They ran like Trist Vagar in like all of their winning games, and people didn't know how to deal with the turret siege, and that like surprised a lot. So at least COG and TSM though were coming in like pretty disadvantaged on the year. So and even with all that, like they were close to getting out of groups.
Honestly, like we weren't close at all. LGD, KT,
TSM was by far that was group of death.
We weren't getting out. Origin, we were the fourth. We were the worst team in that group. I don't think like we played that 100 times. We maybe get out 2 or 3 times.
Sure. And that's obviously even including a world in which actually LGD completely shit the bed the first week. And, people would say if you played that 100 times, that shouldn't happen every time. Obviously, the one that I thought was the real killer was the CLG one, because they were the champions of NA. They got a group that on paper, remember, people didn't know back then about LMS teams being good. The assumption was they were going to be bad because, as you said, Jatt, in past years, you looked at the TPA team, you looked at the Gamma Bears team. These weren't teams that were relevant. It wasn't like the old Type A Assassins. So if you looked at that group, on paper, it was supposed to be, okay, so you've got the Ku Tigers, good team from Korea. You've got CLG, brilliant. And those are supposed to be the top 2 teams. But if people remember, actually the Flash Wolves amazingly won this group by beating the Ku Tigers twice. So it's a very unusual turn of affairs, even for the in theory, NA's best team.
Yeah, that was a weird group. I think they're probably going to be a 3-3 team in this group. I really do think them. And like in maybe 40 times out of 100 with a good boot camp, they make it out. They were in contention to do so, but I wouldn't them to make it out again.
Okay.
This was a tough year, like because this is the year that Europe had the double semifinal approaches as well. Like so much of Worlds as well going over this like comes down to single games. Like Fnatic had an epic base defense against AHQ in one of their games that actually allowed them to like not be in a tiebreaker with Cloud9 to make it out of the group, actually, on the final day. Cloud9 ended up being in the tiebreaker against HQ and lost it anyway. And then that team went on to run into the semifinals that year. It's like the Group B to me was the most competitive group and NA's like best chance. Even IG was supposed to be good in that group. Like the meta shook up so much stuff coming into this World Champion. It's just crazy.
Right.
Why'd you laugh at that, Loco? Like, you're just trying to remember
I
2015. I blocked a lot of it out of my memory, obviously.
IG,
after
the
0-10.
Cacao Skarner, like, oh man, that was such a weird year. I will say, like, one recurring theme is Cloud9 is willing to just play and do what they're good at, and that's something. The Cloud9 is the most successful NA team at Worlds. They've been to Worlds 5 times, and they made it out of group 4 times. That was the one year they didn't make it out of groups.
Okay, so moving to Season 6, this was where the LCS part's much simpler to describe. Basically, you had TSM got double lift. Initially, they were struggling, but they had kind of a super team on paper. Obviously, they had their issues with Yellow Star. CLG, despite losing double lift, actually managed to eventually win the split narrowly over TSM. Then they had that amazing run at MSI. Then in the summer split, the TSM team got in Biofrost and then just kicked in a high gear, dominated the whole league. They were amazing. There was also the Immortal squad, but they didn't make it, so that's not going to be relevant to this discussion because Immortals and Worlds wasn't a thing back then. And then TSM was the very dominant team winning the number 1 seed. CLG, thanks to winning a split, and, you know, Circuit Points got the second one, and then Cloud9, same thing again. They went through the gauntlet, and that was their path to get through to Worlds. So, Season 6 Worlds, right? Start us off then. So you teased us before. Why is there a hypothetical involved here? Why did the results as they are not just sand for you, Jatt?
Listen, I was talking with Loco before, and every year is a disappointment for a lot of NA teams because often they come in pretty hyped. The results were better in 2014 for the NA teams, but I thought the NA teams were better in 2016.
Better,
especially the best one, right?
I think better in relation to the field and better overall. I think teams are still generally improving year over year. So like that's aside from the discussion. Every NA, like across the board, every NA team that went to Worlds was pretty strong. Every team also went 3-3, and every team was grouped with a Korean. So this was one of the harder group draws NA got, and then their win-loss was still the highest win percentage they'd ever had up until this point. Right?
What was the 3? It was Cloud9, TSM, and
CLG.
Yeah, Cloud9, TSM, CLG.
So the classic 3.
Yeah. For instance, like I don't have the exact number on hand, but I remember before the 2017 World Championship, I went back and said, whenever a team is in a group with a Korean and a Chinese team, if you're an NA or EU team, you're basically screwed, right? NA had that twice this year. C9 actually made it out of the group with IMA and SKT. They went 3-3. TSM famously didn't make it out of that group with RNG and Samsung. This is also a year where NA picked up 2 wins against Korean teams. TSM beat Samsung and CLG beat ROX. Like, they actually had some really good wins, but they choked at the end, right? They lost the close games that they needed to win. But I think they displayed a lot of strengths in this Worlds that they hadn't in any previous World. Mm-hmm. Everyone was super disappointed because they were expecting more, but I think they actually did they showed some decent results.
So, okay, obviously it's... Oh, did you have something, Loco?
I think 2014 was when Korea really kicked it. 2013 was the year where Korea really kicked it into gear, where SKT was born, and then 2014 Samsung was born. I can actually agree with you where we're talking 2016. Yeah, 2016 was when NA teams actually started to kick it into gear, with TSM being TSM first getting their actual super team roster together, CLG figuring out their stuff on their own, and C9 scraping by. Actually, I can agree that 2016 NA teams were stronger relative to the field, and 2016 was when they really, really kicked it in.
And in the whole NA versus EU debate, NA 2018, and that shows in the result, making 2 teams to semifinals. Here's a Worlds where NA beat EU, but it doesn't show in the results. CLG went 2-0 against G2 Esports in that Group A, which was actually... That's the one where Albus Nox ended up making it out.
Oh, yeah. G2, that was insane.
The G2, the Sven Mithy Perks G2, went 1-5 in that group. TSM 2-0'd Splice in Group D. NA went 4-0 against EU that year, but H2K made it out number 1 in Group C, played Albus Nox in the quarters, made it to semis, right?
That's the most tainted semis record that EU still holds on to.
They made it to semifinals. You can't take it away from them. Ultimately, winning the clutch games is what matters. You can't say that NA, CLG, deserved to get out of groups. They went 0-2 against Albus Nox Luna, and H2K went 3-0 against them. H2K was still better than COG at that skill test.
We can have that, but
had to make. Yeah.
They hold on to that semi so much, and not all semi-final things are created equal. I will say clutch games matter, and you're definitely right. Like where H2K 3-0'd AlphaSnox, CLG choked where it mattered, but not all semi-finals are created equal.
No, you're absolutely right, because NA's was only in Season 1 Championship.
Yeah, exactly. That's not created equal. Here's the actual what if I had.
Okay, come on.
Okay.
It's the if double if never dashed into crown, what if?
Oh, okay. What would happen?
Go for it. Go for it.
No,
okay.
go for it. What happens if double if doesn't press E into crown?
What could happen?
Yeah.
TSM gets Baron.
Okay.
They beat Samsung.
Okay.
In that game. I think that's the biggest. I think that's actually the biggest stretch in this one. Like that moment, which I think is actually a fairly reasonable thing to happen. That makes them 2-0.
Okay, go ahead.
That makes them 2-0 against Samsung in the group. That means that even if they lose to RNG, they still finish 4-2. The best record in the group is Samsung at 4-2. So TSM gets first seed in that group if they've 2-0 Samsung. That means they play Cloud9 in the quarterfinals. TSM easily beat Cloud9 every time they played them in North America. They move on to semis. They play H2K in semis. NA at Worlds that year was 4-0 against you. They probably beat H2K in the semifinals. That's the what if. If double if doesn't dash into crown, TSM actually has a road to finals, which is like this nuts thing. But they didn't. Group stage is incredibly important. They dropped the game that they couldn't drop, and they didn't make it out of groups. But like that TSM team, results do not show it. But from like team strength, you play this tournament 100 times. You look at scrim results. Was the best NA team. I think that
probably
NA
ever sent to Worlds, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And
the
another what if that happens and they make finals, Andy signs double if Bjergsen and rest of the roster for 5 to 10 years, and that roster would still exist today.
Oh my
God. Well, the funny
God.
thing is, obviously, in your what if, Jatt, they actually do end up getting not that sick of playoff run because they don't play against anyone from China or Korea. But the thing that people won't realize about
finals run for sure, right? Like if they make it in finals.
But the part that people don't realize is because they came in very highly rated, because as you outlined, they looked fantastic. They looked incredibly good, and they had all the players. Like these are all proven players. Well, generally, like Biofrost obviously pretty new, but they had proven players. So as a result, people were saying they're a top 5, top 4 team, which would put them in like a potential semis.
Anything but semis is a disappointment. Was catch fairies.
And the problem is, obviously, people do have a trend of when they see the results, they just retroactively like rewrite the story as like, right, they were overrated, they weren't that good. I will say it doesn't help that they went with the same lineup next year and didn't make it, so it makes it sound like there's some plausibility. But yeah, I agree. That's the rough one about this one. Is like this really was the chance to do an epic run.
Yeah, I mean the 2017 TSM and the 2016 TSM, they had to be different teams stylistically. Like the 2016 team was an early game TSM. 2017 team was a late game TSM. Like they completely changed the way they play. So it obviously hurts their case, and it's why they blew up the roster. Is because they're like, well, if we can't win with an early game team, can't win. And they like
it's cutting out a little bit, Jatt. I don't know why. Is the activation thing set too high or something?
Ooh, I hope
just
not.
double check. It generally only cut out the odd word, so we weren't missing much. But on that one, I couldn't hit half the sentence. So.
Yeah, I'll turn it down.
Just in case it was like a little slightly too high up. I'm not sure why though, because the problem is like we could hear you very well, so I don't know if the mic just.
No, that's probably like an internet thing. It's just set to
enough.
automatic, so I think it should be fine.
It sounds fine at the moment. Right. Let me think.
So there is a world. There is a dimension where TSM goes to finals in 2014.
A dimension, okay.
And 2016, and they're 2-time world finalists.
Yeah. So how many times out of 100 does this happen? Is how we're gonna do this. Like,
okay, so the 2014 one, I would say 20 times out of 100 maybe we can make finals. 20 times out of 100 I can say we make semis.
No. All right, so I need to do this. I need to find the bracket again.
It would have been if they'd have won the group, they would have played EDG and then they would have played OMG in the semifinals.
That's way harder. That's way harder. Like
we were way better, and we could also we could have pushed out other teams from scrimming Samsung White because they didn't want to scrim Samsung Blue because they thought Samsung Blue was their eventual finals partner. So we would have been the exclusive scrim partners of Samsung White after groups. just leading all the way up to finals.
But did they beat? Can you tell me how much they beat? I heard Samsung won like 95% of scrims.
Okay, so they won 95%. They won, I would say, like 80% of the scrims, but majority of their wins came from when we first scrimmed. Towards the end, it was getting more and more even.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like 80%, 90% win rate throughout all of boot camp, but towards the end, we were catching up and we were learning. We're not like monkeys, like where we just bash our head into the wall and we're just losing over and over again. If you have a team that's bad and if you have a team that's good and you make them scrim 1,000 times, when you get to the 1,000 times, you're a lot closer than where you started out as.
All right. I mean, I think it's amazing how we're going through an NA history. 2014 TSM versus 2016 TSM.
Well, I just like the fact that we're doing like the history of NA, and it's already gone into like alternate dimensions, like what could happen. Like that's kind of depressing in itself, right? You know.
The thing is,
it's not been good.
NA is a reason of what ifs. It's not reason of we don't have the resources, we don't have the players. We had the players, we had the resources, our mindset, and one game things screwed us. Where we are talking about what ifs.
I mean, I like to do this as NA, but every region has these what ifs. It's just they don't have to play the game as much because they work for them at least once, right? Like, I don't remember who I was talking to, but someone had a what if of like how G2 could make finals as well in
probably last year, I assume.
Yeah,
because they were in the group where they were close to beating, I think, Samsung in one of the games.
Yeah, exactly. There's like I'm gonna pull that up.
Like if they'd have come out, I think in second. No, let me think. They'd have probably had to have won it because I
think it's extremely similar to the TSM run, right? Because they were in the same TSM group, right? That I just complained about of the RNG and Samsung. And once again, it's actually, I think it's one of the RNG games. They had an early game lead in RNG in that group, and if they win, they move to 4-2. That creates a 3-way tie for first, and then if they can win a tiebreaker, they obviously make it in there. And it's like, okay, well then RNG plays Fnatic G2 gets to play Fnatic in the quarters. Well, they can obviously win that one because they're the best team in Europe. This is when it gets a little dicey because then SKT is up next in the semifinals. But like, SKT was weak that year. Like you can play that game again. Oh, they beat Samsung, who ended up beating SKT. So clearly they're good enough to do that. Like every region can play this what if game. Mm-hmm. So it's still fun.
Okay, then let's move to 2017.
It's fun for the fans, and we can dream.
Real quick, the 2016 team. I always find it funny how C9 was the clutch team, but like CLG went 3-3, Cloud9 went 3-3, and TSM went 3-3, and we're like, Cloud9 always makes it out. Like they're always better. They had the same results as everyone else, and then they got blasted in the quarters. I think if you flip these groups around a little bit, I would have been more excited to see CLG or TSM in the quarters instead of Cloud9 that year. Cloud9 didn't feel like they actually had it together that year, even though they also
got a really nice group when you contrast to the TSM one.
Yeah.
One thing stylistically I will say is TSM's very good at being better than teams and beating teams by being better than them. C9 is good at surprising teams and playing their own game and winning that way. That's been like a stylistic C9 thing. That's true even to this day, where I feel like TSM can never beat teams that are better than them, but C9 is a team that can potentially beat teams better than them, and also lose to teams worse than them.
That's the weird thing that happened in 2016, though. C9 lost both games to SKT, beat IMA twice, and went 1-1 against Flash Wolves, and that got them out of the group, right? It's that weird thing that sometimes the groups in Worlds fall in really weird ways sometimes.
I think it's because of Pool 2. Like, Pool 2 and
flaw
Pool 3 is so wild.
It's because the flaw is that in Pool 2, you have, like, the second best Korean team, or you can get, like, an LMS team. And that's, like, I'd love to live in a world where those were equal, but they're just not, at least in the worlds we've seen so far.
Yeah. Also, Pool 3 is wild, too. Like, you get a wild card, or you get a third seed from NA or Europe or China that could actually be legitimately very strong.
Yeah,
which is obviously what happened to TSM a couple of these years. Right, so moving to 2017 then. Okay, how about this then, Jatt? You alluded to it there. On paper, the exact same TSM lineup goes back, and they go back as champions. They win both the splits, admittedly one of them with Wild Turtle instead of Doublelift, but they dominate again. They go back. and it's a similar scenario, similar like group of like teams where, admittedly, this one was different because this group wasn't like the obviously RNG teams like that were very strong, but this was more like the parity between the group seemed to be very even once it played out.
Yeah, in 2017, this is the group that in 20.
It cut out a little bit.
Can you repeat what you said? Yeah, you
cut out a bit.
Damn it! Sorry.
Is it the mic location?
I think the mic might be too close to you, maybe.
How about now? I think I've been leaning back a little bit.
Okay.
And now I'm closer again.
Yeah,
So
I'll tell you if it
hopefully
cuts out. Don't worry.
Yeah. In 2017, I think TSM got the group they wish they had in 2016, because the TSM team in 2016 was super proactive, and the TSM in 2017 was super reactive, and that left them vulnerable to some of the more aggressive teams. I actually didn't hype this 2017 TSM team up that much. I thought WE was going to win the group out of the play-in because they were the number 3 team from China, even though they were actually really good. And then even with that, it was still like a super close group. If they would have beaten the 05 Flash Wolves, they would have made it out. So this was like another one of those choking at the last. Well, this was more of a choking at the last second one than a what if one, because I didn't think this team would have made that much noise beyond the group.
Was 2017 TSM also very reactive during LCS? Because that was the year I spent in Challenger, so I didn't watch LCS as much as I normally would.
Right, they were.
If you remember, this was the one where when they played Immortals in the final, like the last game, they basically have to do a massive come from behind. Whereas if you think of like 2016 team, they were just like winning all the lanes, like smashing all the games pretty much.
Exactly. So in 2016, TSM's gold difference at 15 in the regular season was plus 1,600. Immortals was plus 1,500 because that was the year Immortals was also like really damn good. And then the rest of the league was like 300 or negative. And then in 2017 summer, they were 4th in gold at 15 with plus 20. So like even in NA, they were playing teams even through the first 15 minutes. Whereas in 2016, they're just blowing them away.
Okay.
So obviously, I think for me, one of the all-time disappointments in Worlds groups has to be this Immortals team, because they looked so good in the summer. The group, okay, it ended up being a tricky one, but on paper it looks great. I mean, Fnatic actually didn't necessarily come in amazing form. Obviously, they'd blown the summer split in Europe. They hadn't gotten to the final. They'd been upset by the Misfits team, from what I remember. Then you had the GAM team. Sure, we knew they were capable of doing some weird stuff from the MSI earlier, but still, it's a wildcard region, so people expect these are supposed to be free wins. What went wrong, Jatt?
Woo! I would agree that this group is like, you want to cakewalk through it to second seed, not first seed.
You assume that, they weren't called Kingzone Dragon X. They were Longju at the time.
Yeah.
You assume Longju's going to win every game. That's the other side of the equation.
Yeah, so like I said before, the Korea-China groups are usually like the groups of death. This was just a Korea group. And then you had the Gigamite Marines, who, while they did make some noise at MSI, you thought they were going to be figured out because they were...
Yes.
And then you also have Fnatic, who like backed into the tournament. This was a time where Fnatic was 0-4. And no team has ever made it out of a group after starting 0-4 because, like, as we mentioned, a lot of times 3-3 doesn't. So Immortals completely fell apart. This was actually this was close to like the C9 04 in 2015 is kind of what this one felt like. And this was what people are now like retroactively going back and saying is NA's problem every year, but this was very much everyone was playing stuff like Ezreal jungle in week 1 and then realizing that it didn't work that well in week 2, and then no one told Immortals. And then they like just kept playing that stuff. And then after all that, like if Cody Sun doesn't rocket jump into Fnatic, then they go first, right? Like if he doesn't,
NAD carries and the Immortal last players.
I know. Good God, that Immortals wouldn't have made noise after the fact. I don't think either, but they should have made it out of this group.
And then obviously the other team was CLG again, right? No, Cloud9, obviously. It's always Cloud9. Right, so Cloud9 this year.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I should talk about Immortals.
Yeah, okay. Wait there a second. It's cutting out completely now.
Damn it.
Lean in. Or angle the
Sorry.
mic.
I'm just going to turn off that feature, and I will fix that.
Just
forever.
push to talk, yeah. That would also work.
Um,
Or did you have it on automatic?
so if I just turn the input sensitivity like way down, that doesn't matter, does it? Like you still you don't hear a
If you
bunch
put
of
it all
brake
the way
noise?
to the bottom, it'll just pick up everything. So in theory, I guess that would work.
What about now? Do you hear like it sounds fine?
I would put a little bit up. We hear like some noises in the
A
back.
little bit up, yeah.
Sorry. All right, sorry. Hopefully that doesn't mess up your recording too
That's
much.
all right.
It should be good.
I'm
now.
not going to edit it anyway, so whoever edits this, God bless. Thanks, everyone.
The 3-hour NA.
I think
history.
there's going to be some problems with it, but overall the quality of...
Okay, sorry.
you
Loco
actually
just
cut out
out.
there, Loco.
Yeah,
Oh, really?
we're
Yeah.
trolling.
I think you're too close to your mic now or something. I don't know. The problem is I'm not a sound tech engineer, am I? So I don't really know what the problem is. I just know it didn't work. So
Yeah. Anyway, this team with Xmithy, Pobelther, and Ole was pretty close to modern day TL. It's just TL upgraded the 80 carry position. Flame played a little bit of carry, so like the Immortals team was actually not bad. They were really solid. They had really good team play, which is why I think they should have been able to. Like the Fnatic team did feel a little bit like not put together back then. They have it like Caps. Reckless said in the podcast in 2018 that Caps didn't even know how to play side lanes in 2017. So like their macro was bad. They didn't play what everyone else considered to be like the optimal way. So yeah, that's a big disappointment for me that Immortals didn't make it out. But I thought they were a decent team.
They're a very weak mental team if you look at it overall. Xmithy, Poe. While you think Xmithy, Poe were rocks, they're more result of like the very good mental players on their team, which was usually double Afro on CLG and then now double on TL.
Right.
And then like Ole and Cody are extremely emotional players. So is Flame. So that team, like if bot lane or top lane doesn't go well, I can see it like crumbling. It's easy to say in hindsight, but I think that team had huge flaws in terms of emotional stability and like just leadership.
okay. So Jatt, here's the thing. Cloud9 not only got out again, but they bucked your trend. They got a Korean and a Chinese team, and they got out because obviously this was the one where EDG very much underwhelmed. SK Telecom was weak SK Telecom, but there was still SK Telecom.
Yeah.
What do you say about this Cloud9 team? Because it does feel a bit like they weren't the strongest NA team, even though they got out this time, right?
Yeah, I mean, Cloud9 did it in 2016 as well because Aime was in their group as well as one. But yeah, this was another one that was incredibly close. And C9 deserved every win they got in this 3-3 group. But oftentimes, getting 3-3 means you need a little bit of help afterwards. Because EDG was, if you played like a 30-game group stage, potentially the second best team in this group. They had massive gold leads against SKT both times they played them, and then lost both games. So EDG started 0-3, nearly went on the miracle run on the final day, although we thought they were going to 3-0, but then they lost to SKT down the stretch, which means they didn't tie with C9, which means C9 didn't have to play a tiebreaker, and they went on. But if you play like another alternate universe, the same way we did of like alternate universe, TSM moves on, alternate universe, like alternate universe, C9 loses a tiebreaker game to EDG, and we continue the like lol, no teams out of group memes. I thought this Cloud9 team was actually pretty good, and I thought this group was super hard. Like I thought EDG was a good team who choked. SKT was obviously still SKT. They made it all the way to the finals this year, even if they weren't as good as in previous years.
Sure.
And AHQ was the weak team, but still clearly lethal enough to take a game against EDG. And they even took the game off of SKT in this group. So this was actually one of the hardest groups in the tournament. So C9 deserved to get out.
What do you think, Loco? How would you define the NA teams at last year's Worlds?
I mean, overall, just disappointing. I know a lot of our conversation has been focused on TSM, but 2017 was the year of TSM. So I think how TSM did, which is overrode everything. It overrode. It overrode CL. I honestly think TSM's disappointment overrode C9's success of making it out of group.
Well, I guess if you think logically, that's the one result that doesn't make sense is the TSM one, because if anything, like Jatt said, on paper, EDG is supposed to get out, so Cloud9 doesn't. But then on the other side of the equation, a lot of people would have thought Immortals does get out, so it would have been the same basic, like, one team gets out anyway, but it's the TSM one that's the killer again.
I think Immortals was such an afterthought to that entire Worlds and to that entire year. They were good, but I personally always view them as flaws, so I wasn't very interested in them. I thought C9 was done for due to the groups, and TSM was like the hope of NA, and like TSM should have done better. That was my overview of Worlds. That was probably the Worlds I was the most disconnected from because I was in Challenger scene, but that was my like looking through, from a far distance. Hey, TSM strong. Hopefully they get out. They show NA. Immortals flawed. I don't think they're gonna do well. Cloud9, they're fucked. That group is way too tough.
But the craziest thing about this is that C9 was a game away from semis. Like, they were an incredibly tough group. Then they played WE in the quarters, and holy crap, that series was close. There was, once again, the biggest what if moment, like the breaking point from an NA fan's perspective of this series was actually game one, when Sneaky was on Caitlyn and Mystic was on Kog'Maw. And this was the game where Sneaky actually set the DPM world record. It was the most DPM anyone had ever done in the game. It was like a 70-minute game on Caitlyn, did like 1,500 DPM. And there was a moment where C9 was going to break open the game and win it, and they had 4 people just like on top of each other mobbing Mystic's Kog'Maw. And he crits Sneaky 4 times in a row and kills him. Like, as the 4 people are killing Mystic.
Sneaky doesn't have a great history with
Sneaky doesn't heal. He doesn't do anything to prevent it because, like, you couldn't even see who Mystic was hitting. Like, C9 was so far on top of each other, and he just did so much damage in such a short time. Anyway, they lose game 1. They still push it to 5 games. They lose game 5. But, like, damn, that was a close series. And I thought it would have been so fitting if, like, that C9 team who, like, squeaks out of group stage ended up being the team to push NA to semis and be like, oh, wow, look, we can finally, say we made a real semis if you don't count season 1. But they didn't, like usual.
I can see an obvious question coming up later down our call, which is TL going to break out of, make it out of groups and then break it into semis? Let's save that question for later.
Okay. So let's do that then. Let's have the basically the prediction preview part of the show, which is let's talk about the 3 teams for this year. So what I think we should do is let's talk about them in isolation and then talk about like the potential group scenarios. Because even though Plains isn't done yet, you can vaguely figure out based on the regional aspect where you can't have 2 teams from the same region, like what groups you could end up in. So okay, let's start then with let's team we could last for that reason then. What about this then? Let's start with the most contentious team, Jatt, which is obviously 100 Thieves, because sure, they were second place in the spring split. They lost to the champion in the summer split, but they had that whole scenario with the Cordy Sun and Rikara swap out, and then because they qualified on circuit points, then people wanted to say, but TSM or whoever, would have beaten them in this scenario, but they obviously didn't have to play them. So what would you say is your expectations? What do you think of 100 Thieves right now going into Worlds?
I have low expectations for 100 Thieves going into Worlds. The biggest argument people can use against them is you look at the best of 5s they've won. They've beaten Clutch in the spring, FlyQuest in the summer. Then they've lost to TL, and lost to TSM. But they were a good regular season team in an incredibly close regular season. So one thing I will say about NA overall as a whole, and this is, again, like my opinion, not every NA analyst thinks the same way. I think this year, NA teams got worse in comparison to 2017. And I think the reason for that was that when we franchised, there was such a huge infusion of cash, especially at the bottom of the league, that a lot of the best teams got split apart. We only had 9 returning starters from 2017 LCS teams on the same team at the start of 2018, out of obviously a possible 50 if all 10 teams stayed the same. So 100 Thieves is a completely new team. We mentioned Team Liquid is like a reskinned Immortals with some improvements. So they would have been a top team last year as well. But I think they're like the only team that really would have been a true top team in last year. We'll get to C9 in a bit because there's like a lot of rookie potential in that team. But 100 Thieves had the ability to beat any team that didn't have it together. So that's why they were consistently good in the regular season.
Yes.
And they deserve to go to Worlds. Like, don't get me wrong.
I'm guessing that's a bad sign for going to the World Championship, though, right?
But when you're
If you
going
only
to World
beat the teams below you.
Championship, and you got the number 1 team in Europe who won both splits in Fnatic, and you got the number 2 team in China who looks like a powerhouse this year, who went 18-1 in both regular seasons and only lost game 5s against RNG in both playoffs to stop them from being champions. Like, that's a really hard 2 teams to be in a group, and it's an uninspiring NA team. So I don't have huge hopes for 100 Thieves.
So 100 Thieves are the benefactor of TSM shitting the bed, CLG shitting the bed, and Cloud9 shitting the bed in spring.
It's so negative. Like, all these stories about NA are like so negative coming into the year, but I think there is like a good amount of truth to it this year.
TSM was non-existent in spring and summer. They weren't non-existent. CLG as a team that we know of was non-existent. They completely fucked up building their roster. I think Reignover is a player with very clear strengths and very clear weaknesses. Extremely smart, great pathing, great communication, resource-free, great enabler. Terrible at carrying, terrible at being assertive, and you give him 2 very smart laners that are good at split pushing, but that are weak earlier on. And the combination of the 3 just works so badly with each other. I think Huhi, Reignover, and Darshan, the 3 of them, just amplify their weaknesses so much by being on the same team. So CLG, how they built their roster, made it completely disappear. I actually think their bot lane was decent, but I think the combination of Reignover, Huhi, and Darshan was one of the worst roster building I've seen. All these players were part of championship rosters, and they played a certain role, but you put them together in a wrong way.
Right. There's a lot of different analogies. It's like when the Bulls put together Jimmy Butler, Derrick Rose, and Dwayne Wade on the same team, and it's a bunch of like 2 guards that can't shoot threes. Yes. It's like you can't space the floor properly. Like, you can't play the map properly with those 2 players. I like that point.
So CLG disappear. TSM in spring, I actually think we're ramping up correctly. They were ramping up and they were getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And Clutch, oh my god, I love and hate Clutch Gaming, because I think if Clutch Gaming didn't beat that TSM team, they would have done better in summer and they would have had better results in spring, and they would have been like, oh, we can be this kind of team. But the biggest flaw of TSM this year was 0 identity whatsoever. Haunter is like this weird tank and carry player that doesn't ask for ganks early and is very inconsistent. Zemet and Mithy have always played alongside of a carry top laner. So as expect, who else am I missing? And so as expect, those are the two ones that come to mind right now from Origin. But they are very good at being resource free early. They play a lot of Kench, they play a lot of Braum, they play a lot of Israel, and they can pull their weight without having resources, without getting ganked consistently. And then Bjerg is a player that does well on carry champions, that does well on assassin champions, and will ask for resource. So the only time TSM did well was when Bjerg was on a carry champion or an assassin champion that could receive ganks and do well, like Zillion, like Akali. And when he wasn't given that, TSM had nothing to do early game. And that was their biggest problem. So CLG, TSM just disappeared. The 2 most historical, the most successful NA orgs decided to not exist for a year. So yeah, it's like if Korea didn't have SKT and KT for a year. It's like if Europe didn't have Fnatic and G2 for a year.
And also, technically, Immortals decided not to exist.
Yeah,
but not of their own choice.
Decided.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I know this is like the NA episode, but I want to jump off what Loco said there. It's like so many of the teams that NA had at Worlds last year aren't there this year, but then when you look at the reasons why, it makes you figure out how strong you think the region is. So when we're saying why CLG and TSM aren't there, it's because of mistakes they've made. It's not because these other teams have surpassed them by getting better, right? In Korea, we had SKT, Longju, and Samsung, who's now named Genji, all in the regional qualifier, right?
Yes.
Because a Freak of Freaks took a step up this year. KT didn't choke this year. Griffin, who was also in the regional qualifier, was a team that didn't exist and had a ton of new talent that played like a lot of these meta-breaking things and really shook up the way people looked at Korean League of Legends. And yes, you can say that like Longzhu started choking more and started questioning their identity, and SKT didn't find a good top laner or jungler, but like the core theme of why they weren't there was because these other teams like found an identity and surpassed them while they were struggling.
Sure.
Whereas in NA, I feel like some of the teams, Team Liquid found their identity and they were clearly at the top of the league. They're actually the first NA team to 3-0 both the spring and summer finals in the same year, even if the regular season wasn't incredibly great. I know Loco's like, is that true? I'm pretty sure it is.
It is.
And yeah, other than that, though, there's like completely unproven stuff. C9 would be more of the Griffin story from NA this year in the fact that it is a lot of rookies, and there is that sense of optimism that if they put everything together and they don't choke on the international stage, maybe they'll be good. That's why I actually predicted them in the finals, because I thought they would be able to do that, but I think they pretty clearly choked against TL in the finals, which is why experience actually does matter a lot. But I think it's going to be a tough year for NA. I'm not expecting a huge amount of stuff from them.
What do you think, though? Because a factor that, funnily enough, for Western teams was never really something that they took into account was how you use the subs. Now, Korea, for a number of years, has been using subs, particularly, obviously, most famously SK Telecom at the jungle position, so they could still make Bengi work and have some strengths. Cloud9 is obviously a team that legitimately, if they had their own choice, would run a 7-man rotation. And we have seen them literally in playoff games, sub in, jungler and mid lane, and obviously it was pretty clear they used I used like the hockey line analogy, where they wanted certain players to play with each other relative to what that player would do. So, you know, they wanted Svenskeren with Golden Glue because of what it did to the team, whereas you want the other one with Blabber, with Jensen. So the question is this, okay, with the sub situation, obviously you can't have both the subs at Worlds. How does that impact Cloud9, do you think, and their chances?
I'd say it takes like, if they were a 100 with 7 players, I think they're like a 93. I'm pulling a number out of my hat with 6.
Sure.
Like I understand that Svenskeren and Golden Glue had its own synergy, like goodness, but they even played Svenskeren and Jensen in the finals. Like they were very willing to do that as a third strategy. And jungler is just the better second look. You're going to lose a little bit when you run Sven Jensen, but I think they'll still do it if Blabber has, and they'll still have that, if Blabber Jensen struggle, and they'll still have that like card in their back pocket. I don't think it actually hurts them that much, even though it definitely hurts them.
Do you actually think, though? Oh yeah, sorry. I thought the other part to...
What do you think Golden does better than Jensen?
I think he just brings a different look to the mid lane. I think that's why they brought Jensen, is it's really hard to have strong differences in how the mid lane plays, but like every player jukes skill shots differently, and every player aims skill shots differently. I think Jensen's better than Golden in most ways, and if anything, he's better with Svenskeren because of reps. That's pretty much it, I think, right now. How about you?
I think Jensen. I personally think it's a mental thing where Golden and Sven coming in is very like refreshing. Like Sven and Golden are extremely positive people, and I think they're the mood setters. Where Jensen and Blabber, when they lose, I can imagine like them both being extremely quiet. I don't know Blabber that well. I don't know Jensen that well, but I know like positive aspects of Golden and Svenskeren, and they're just like very bubbly and positive, poppy people. Like, let's do this, bros.
Yeah, that actually reminded me of something. Golden Glue talks more than Jensen. He is definitely a better communicator than Jensen in game.
Okay.
What about this, though? The other side of that equation is presumably a positive, right, Jatt? Which is that in the past, like I said, even if you had a sub on paper, they weren't actually actively part of a rotation. But this gives an NA coach potentially a different look to give opponents. You can change up which player is going to be playing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it helps. The only thing is, like with all the math going through, there is an extremely high chance that C9 goes in Group B.
Yes,
with
which,
RNG,
by the
GNG,
way,
and Vitality.
Is the group of death, basically. Because, yes, as you say, you've got Royal Never Give Up, the team that's won all the tournaments in China. You've got GenG, the reigning champions. This lineup has been in the finals twice in a row.
Yeah.
And then, just as the third group, you have Team Vitality, who obviously made it to the semi-finals in Europe and won out the gauntlet.
Although, I got to say, do you care if I tell people...
No, actually, they were circuit points.
Do you care if I tell people when we're recording this?
No, that's fine.
No.
Yeah, so it's during day 2 of play-in. I haven't been watching the games. I have it on pause, but I've been getting tweets. Supermassive beat G2 in the first game. So like, if there's a world in which EU doesn't, like if G2 doesn't make it out of play-in, like somehow Supermassive actually beats them in the group, and then they have to play against like EDG in the best of 5 to get in, like then C9 actually could move out of that group. Because the only reason they're locked into Group B is because
the regional aspect.
Yeah, the regional aspect of how teams fall. And if you pull out a region, then it's less locking.
What's up with C9 at Miracles?
Wouldn't that be something if they like get dropped into Group A instead, and then they just have to be better than Flash Wolves again? Like that would be the dream for C9.
That seems like a very C9 kind of run also. Like C9 is always like the team of miracles.
Okay, there's one team left.
Team
and here's the problem, is that in some ways you've already drained some of the hype out of this, Jatt, because you've already implied that you don't think it's that, you know, all the they didn't best, you know, the TSM squad before. They didn't beat out the past great CLG squad. I mean, technically they took 3 of the players, like, you know, if you go back far enough. What do you actually think of Team Liquid's chances?
Okay, so speaking about Team Liquid, one thing I think they'll do that where a lot of the classic super team from NA has been TSM, and where they fail is TL will stick to their identity no matter what. TL has an identity in double lift, identity in playing bot side, identity in playing team fight oriented, and they play with the pattern and they play everything correctly. So when I was doing VOD review for TL, one thing super interesting that I noticed is how highly they prioritize Dragon, and they do it right every single time. Where they place vision, it's well coached. Their success isn't random. They repeatedly do the same thing that they know works, and they know how to adapt to it. Whenever TL gets Baron, you guys will notice this very often. They'll always push 4 mid, 1 bottom. Never 4 mid, 1 top. Why? Because potentially dragons spawn on bottom side, so whenever they push and they're done with the push, they'll always take dragon on the exit. So they're just little things that you can notice about TL. I won't go too much in detail. Like for the teams that are scouting TL, like do your research. They will play the same way and they'll execute it really well. And if you're not better than them, you're just gonna lose to them. If you are better than them, you'll beat them pretty consistently. But yeah, I mean, TL is a very consistently strong NA team with an identity. They remind me of a Korean team. They are coached and they play like a Korean team.
I mean, they have 2 Korean teams on it, and they have a Korean coach as well, right? So I have a stat that I pulled before playoffs that speaks to this as well. I was watching an IG VOD, and I was like, man, it really feels like they can test vision well because the other support was always dead. Like anytime that support would go for something, he'd be dead. And it made me think about NA. Let's get a stat that shows how much damage, like what damage percentage they do to different roles on the map. Like how much damage how often can they kill? It was kill percentage. Sorry, I'm messing this setup. Like how often does the enemy team kill this role? And across the league, there actually wasn't that much variance. You'd see like a 2 or 3% difference in top laner kills versus jungle kills, except for TL, where they were actually 4% higher in killing the enemy AD carry than any other team in the league. And it's because all of their setup is around bottom lane in the early game. Sometimes it's through mid, like sometimes they get a 2v2 control, but then they'll set up wards in the river the right way to control dragon the right way. Doublelift and Ole are always in a position where they can win the 2v2 because they're the best 2v2 lane in the league, but then the rest of the team wards around it like in a really disciplined way. So
yeah, ward setup, mid priority, they just do it perfectly every time.
And when it really matters, like they're all experienced in their clutch. And that's why they 3-0'd C9 in the final. That's why they 3-0'd 100 Thieves in the spring final, right? Like that's their strength for sure.
So like when you coach, you notice little things. Like, so when you watch, I don't think TL does this, but some teams do it. The wave they're going to dive on, like as the wave is spawning, they'll ping that wave and they'll dive on it. TL must have a system, but they execute their system correctly every single time. And when that system goes wrong, they know how to adapt to. Okay, if plan A doesn't work, we do plan B. Like they're just very well coached, and it's really refreshing to see an NA team play and work this way.
I would like to see 2018 TL play against 2017 TSM.
They would. 2017 TSM, I think they get. Actually, I'm not
Right?
sure. Mid and jungle is where, if I pick out one weakness for TL compared to world teams, it's mid and jungle. But Pope Belter and Xmithy really showed up during the finals. That's where I thought C9 would best them. Either Jensen Blabber or Golden Glue Sven or Jensen Sven would be better than Xmithy Pope Belter in mid 2v2. But TL mid 2v2 won almost every single time. So if they continue that strength and they can shore up that weakness versus like these top tier teams, then I can see them doing really well.
There's also that weird wrinkle that because Xmithy, Paul Belter, and Doublelift were on the CLG team, they've already been to Worlds together. And obviously separately, they've also been to Worlds. It's like it's happened a bunch of times. So they have experience.
Yeah, listen, this is, C9 Miracle Group because of G2 not making it to groups, notwithstanding. Like, if that happens, TL is the best chance that NA has to make it out of groups. I do worry that EDG could be drawn into this group. There's I believe, 50-50 chance of that happening, them or G2. But like, let's say G2 goes in the group. TL would be the favorite to be second in this group, right? So I want to see what they can do. But like, as I mentioned, because of all the franchising stuff happening, like that's why I would be just super curious analytically to see this team placed in previous iterations of the NALCS, because they're clearly the best team in this one, but I wonder where that strength is coming from.
Plus, it's also worth pointing out, in a world in which EDG did go into that group, this is actually the year where if TL really is supposed to be really good, you should beat EDG, because actually EDG wasn't even supposed to be at Worlds. Everyone thought it was going to be Rogue Warriors or the Jing Dog team. They actually were doing pretty terribly, and then they just at the end did their own miracle run through the gauntlet, basically. Aside from that, though, obviously the matchup everyone wants to see in the group is the KT Rolster versus Team Liquid game. Now, is there a world in which Team Liquid beats them?
Yeah, I mean, there's always worlds in the universe.
We have started learning that, yeah.
There's a world where it's like make finals of Worlds.
Is Jatt secretly Doctor Strange out of the Avengers movie or whatever it was, where he's calculated all the alternate dimensions? It's like, in which one does TSM win Worlds?
In 15 Worlds out of 100, TL takes a game off KT.
Right. That's not bad. It's not as bad as people would think.
I mean, that's pretty bad. That's like... So if I said in 20, that would actually give them a 10% chance of winning an individual game. So, like, it's pretty low. But
no, I mean it as much as I would go. I'd bet my house on KT Rolster to win that game.
2-0? Because they get 2 tries.
Because here's the problem, okay? I guess this is in one way one of the interesting things about the Team Liquid squad is that obviously Doublelift has been heavily criticised for some of his past Worlds performances and all these different teams that didn't get out of groups. Well, this team really is the one where it almost is like the meme. Like, it's just set up around Doublelift, and this is his team, and if he's going to be the star, then he carries, and then they do amazingly. So there's a lot of pressure on him for this Worlds, I think.
Can I touch on a little bit on the KT versus TL matchup?
Yeah.
KT, where their strengths lie versus TL, match up super favorably. Where Svet versus Impact is almost exclusively tanks unless he gets Gangplank, and KT can do enough research where they're like, okay, if you don't want Impact to play carry, ban Gangplank, or take Gangplank and then force him onto tanks, and then we can play carry topside. And where TL's biggest strength is their bot lane 2v2 and synergy with their jungler, that's exactly KT's strength. Their bot lane 2v2 with Mata and Deft, and also synergy with Score. So where TL is strong, I feel like KT is stronger. If they had like different kind of strengths, I can see TL being more favored. But for the team TL is and like how they line up versus KT, I actually think it's really unfavorable for them. Yeah. I think if they play different teams of KT's level, they would have a better shot. But the way KT is formed lines up so well versus TL.
Yeah, you can continue it to the mid jungle as well. Like, Score is super Xmithy. He's just all the things we say that are good about Xmithy. Score is best in class in those things. And UCal actually plays mid lane fairly similar to how TL wants Pobelter to play mid lane, as in like shove and support sides. So, yeah, I agree. It's a bad matchup. And just better players across the board.
But so KT are chokers. That's the only thing TL has to go through that. KT are chokers.
And as much as we say Doublelift has had bad Worlds, Doublelift had a really good MSI, which I think could potentially give them the confidence for this. Like, there's a chance they had a little bit of a eureka moment at MSI because they started so badly. Ole famously benched himself. They put in Joey. But then, like, they really did say we were expecting all these other teams to play perfectly, and it changed the way we play, and that is super evident that happened to 2017 TSM when Doublelift is on it, and it was evident early on in MSI. But then towards the end of the group, they changed that. They did win a game against Fnatic. They did win a game against RNG, who also matches up unfavorably for TL in the fact that a lot of people say TL is like junior RNG. But they were still able to take a game off them. So if Doublelift plays the same way he does in the second half of MSI group stage in this group, I think they get out.
Yeah, I mean, one thing historically about Doublelift is a slow learner, but when things click, it clicks. Like, he didn't win anything, and then it clicked, and he won everything in NA. He didn't have any kind of success internationally. This year, maybe it's finally going to click at Worlds, and he'll have continuous success internationally.
Okay, what about this then? So the one last topic we had, and this is obviously quite a relevant one in a world in which so many people were implying, 100 Thieves making it wasn't deserved, etc. What about some players from the NA region to highlight who didn't make it to Worlds? Who do you think is worthy of sort of like the honourable mention to that scenario?
Let's start with the obvious. Bjerg. So I actually want to ask Jatt. I'm not sure if you participated in Riot Top 20, and if you already did, if you can't talk about it, where would you...
Well, we haven't done top 20 yet. We'll record it after play-in. The lists are like soft locked right now.
Okay. So where would you put Bjergsen in terms of mid laners if he did participate out?
If he did so let's do another universe game. Let's say Bjergsen doesn't get 3-0'd by C9 in the regional qualifier, sure. or like one better. Let's say C9 beats TL in final, and then TSM just beats 100 Thieves again, right? Like that strength that TSM goes to Worlds. In that world, I don't think Bjergsen is top 20. I think he's like somewhere between 20 and 30 going towards this Worlds, because I like to weigh the chance that you think this player will succeed at World Championships, past World Championships into account, as well as recent performance. And even though his recent performance improved a lot towards the end of the split, like all the fact that TSM doesn't have a good identity and Bjergsen isn't going to be put in positions to succeed, and the fact that even when he was on teams, it looked like they would be able to do that, they still didn't perform well. I don't think he would have been top 20.
Okay.
Because for people who don't know, even though, yes, the meme is that Jatt loves TSM, you have said in a number of past years that for the next ranking, I mean, obviously you did make it every year in the past, for the next ranking you wouldn't put him in the top 20. Even though you did also temper that. So the question is this, Jatt. It's obviously a very hot button topic of whether or not Bjergsen did have problems at Worlds and didn't perform very well. Do you think he played differently when he went to Worlds than the Bjergsen everyone remembers fondly from the LCS?
A little. I think he played a little differently at Worlds. Like last year is the biggest example where I think he was the most misaligned from his top 20 Worlds ranking versus Worlds performance, because he didn't really do anything at Worlds in 2017. Like, he very much just waited for the game to happen around him and was like, when a play happens, I'm going to be ready to capitalize on that thing. But he never created his own advantages in almost any moment. And like, even the games that he carried against Misfits, where like, you forget they actually won a pretty clutch group stage game against Misfits where they're like way behind and his Cassiopeia like popped off. Those were all reactive plays. It's like Misfits messed up a dive and then Bjergsen started doing stuff. He didn't make any plays on the map. So I think that's where he was making plays in NA in 2017 and he didn't make plays at Worlds in 2017.
Right, come on, Loco.
I don't want to harp too much on a Bjergsen topic because he's not participating.
Yeah.
But two questions.
But he is the most famous player in NA.
Okay, two questions. If you became GM of a franchise, are you starting with Doublelift or are you starting with Bjergsen? That's the first question. Let's go.
That's it?
Yeah.
Doublelift.
First question. Doublelift? Explain.
I think it's based off of this year. I think you've essentially got to see that play out this year where TSM got to rebuild their roster around Bjergsen, and TL got to rebuild the roster from scratch around Doublelift, basically, and they just plugged Immortals into a team that supports Doublelift, and they've been more successful in this case, from like a recent performance perspective.
You don't think it was mistakes in roster building from TSM? If someone else built the roster that was more cohesive around Bjergsen or gave Bjergsen better pieces to play with?
Yeah, I mean, I think like in 2017 or 2016 or 2015 or 2014, like I'd say Bjergsen, right? He's the best player in North American LCS history still, I think. But right now, man, the being a prisoner of the moment right now is of kind of a very real thing. And because Bjergsen hasn't shown the recent success or the ability to take a team over the top, and because when Bjergsen and Doublelift split this year after being brought together and being like, Doublelift was a leader of, not the leader, he was one of the main parts of CLG when CLG won. They were both the best players in their role when they were on TSM. They split up this year. Bjergsen has been in a position to lead. Like, as much as they say they're bringing in these other people, Doublelift was also put into a position to lead, and he did, right? They won back-to-back titles on TL, so that's why right now I would build a team around Doublelift.
Okay.
How about you? Are you Bjergsen? Sounds like?
Man, so I don't want to be personal, but I personally dislike Doublelift, and I personally like Bjergsen. And I'll say another thing. It's much easier to... If I'm building a team around Bjerg, I can import good ADs where it would work. But if I'm building a team around Double, Pobelter is uniquely the one mid laner that works really well with Double.
But I mean, TSM imported a good AD in Sven.
They did, but Sven Mithi was functioned really weirdly. I would have loved to seen TSM pick up Smoothie. When Smoothie was like branching off from C9, I think Smoothie getting slotted into TSM would have fixed so many of their problems. But like the current TSM we see is like there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of star power, but there's also a lot of problem. Where TL, there's a lot of star power and it is cohesive. I lean slightly more towards Bjerg due to mid lane just being super core, and like if I have two players of equal skill level, I would probably always take mid lane over AD, but the question's been getting much harder every year.
I know, and I think it's super close, and I think even the MSI results change the answer, right? Like the fact that RNG has won with Uzi now at MSI and in LPL is like, can AD carry be the most important role on the team, and can you build around an AD carry? Because previously the answer was no.
There's a lot of teams at Worlds that have the best AD carry in their region this time.
Exactly.
Right?
That was all the teams.
You're making a really good argument. You're starting to change my mind. Oh man. Okay. Second question that I had.
There's a lot of other good players at Worlds for NA.
But second question I had, last question regarding Bjerg. Do you think Jensen is the best mid laner in NA now over Bjerg?
He was the best this split. I don't know if I would build a team around him over like the history of success, but this split he was the best mid laner, I thought.
All right. What about other good NA players that didn't make Worlds this year?
Oh, that didn't make?
Obviously the Bjergsen ones are like a legacy and we have to step. But let's get a couple more.
Yeah, so Bjergsen, Sven Mithi, like Sven Mithi not making it is also like hugely impactful. The fact that they'd been dominating Europe as well is huge. But Huni not making Worlds is actually pretty surprising.
Huni's so flawed.
He is, but his flaws worked for years in NA and EU. He stepped back. I think he was more flawed in the summer split, but he dominated the spring split, and he dominated like a lot of his time on Immortals. Like Huni and Dardoch were really lethal as flawed as they were. Like I'm just surprised that in a flawed NA region, the strengths of Huni and Dardoch couldn't carry them to Worlds.
But their strengths were, if you're good at team fighting, if you're good at late game, you can make 10 mistakes early and mid game and make one right decision later on to win. Where their strengths are, they'll make 10 right decisions and they'll make one mistake to lose. Where their strengths are early, their strengths are skirmishes, their strengths are knowing the lane, diving, starting skirmishes. Their strengths aren't team fighting, their strengths aren't macro. Their strength gives you the lead, but it doesn't give you that final it's not that final step in winning. So they're good at 9 things, but that one thing they're bad at is actually so fatal. So I think Huni, unless he changes how he plays and like what he really puts focus on, I think is gonna see less and less results. He's starting to remind me of Piglet a little bit.
I mean, and you've mentioned him as a duo there, but Dardoch presumably another name we could mention, right?
Yeah, I mean, that dude still seems super flawed. Like both him and Hooney, Echo Fox is going to build around him, but like
I
they
think it's
messed up so
possible.
much of the roster. It's definitely possible. If they keep them together for like years and years, eventually they're going to find a way to Worlds. We'll see.
So who are Zeben, Mitti, Bjerg, Dardocht? Who else are we missing? Oh, what'd you think about Hakuo? Hakuo Febevin actually from Clutch. Those are the other two key players that we didn't talk about.
Oh man, they fell off so hard. I thought Febby at the end of the summer split was pretty bad.
Clutch checked out.
Yeah, something boomed inside that team. And I don't know if it's going to be the same team for 2019.
It was
I'd be really
basically
surprised.
the professional team version of what happened to him in that solo queue game where he was complaining that like his teammates are so bad and why is he not allowed to just run it down mid? So, which was not a good look, by the way. You know, I wouldn't stream that one, mate, if I were you.
Yeah.
Febevin, I think, is like a franchise-worthy player. I think he's not the number one player I would start with, but if I was given Febevin to start a franchise, that's something I'd strongly consider.
So if we think he quit, would a franchise-worthy player quit on his team when they still have a chance of going to Worlds?
I think a lot of franchise-worthy players at that age would, under that
He's been playing for like 4 years.
He moved to NA. A lot of things are falling apart like around him. I guess Featherman has been like mentally at time. We would say Reckles is a franchise-worthy player. That time he went to Elements and like completely disappeared. Like,
yeah,
I mean, he still is a franchise-worthy player.
True.
Double F for like what 3-4 years, didn't win a single thing. Cocky, trash talker, hard to work with, toxic. Still franchise-worthy. Like,
all right, that's fair.
His skill level,
I think
like,
they need to find a way of like harnessing his skill level and motivating him over a long period of time.
I think Featherman, due to what he's shown, still gets one more year of being toxic and like, or no, I'm not even sure he's toxic. I honestly haven't worked.
Just
with
flawed in some way, sure.
But he gets one more year of being flawed. After that one more year of being flawed, we can take him off the franchise list. But I still think he's shown enough where he's still like, yeah, he's shown enough. He's shown a lot in spring.
Yeah, it's true.
Oh, another example, Jensen. When Jensen first was on C9, or even for like a year or two, we were saying like Jensen's not going to work out. Like, what is it? He's too much of a solo queue player. Playing on a team environment won't work for him. Like, look at Jensen now. We literally just said he was the best mid laner this split. I think Featherman gets one more year of fucking up, and after that, then we can start taking him off that list. Are we missing anyone? I some days at Worlds. I keep that alternate universe where TSM didn't go to Worlds. Man, we talked about 100 Thieves, but we didn't even touch on Someday as a player.
Yeah, I mean, Sunday's going to Worlds. He's still super good. Like, I actually thought his spring split wasn't that good, but in summer he was a lot better. There was a lot of games where like 100 Thieves doesn't play around Someday, but Someday still performs extremely well. I also don't know if you can win playing around Someday in NA. Like, that's the weird puzzle I haven't been able to crack yet. He's been in NA for so long now, right? Like, he was on Dig. Like, whenever he plays carry picks, it feels like they lose. But when he's on like bruisers or tanks, he just smashes.
You can't win around playing around top in NA. Playing around top, you eventually get outscaled by.
Doesn't C9 play around top?
Somewhat, but I would say C9 plays around mid more so than top. They do play around top after mid, but traditionally for the history of NA, teams have always played around mid and bottom, and it's because having a stronger backline makes team fighting much easier, and you're not on a timer. So, I mean, if you think classic powerhouse teams, TSM, Team Liquid, any team that had like a really strong top side, if you think Immortals, right, with Huni, that team didn't succeed in NA, and I don't think it's a coincidence. And in Korea, the vice versa has been true, because they play so tempo-oriented, and they position really well for flanks. Traditional Korean powerhouse teams have played around top. Marin, SKT, SMEP, Longju, or SMEP, Koot Tigers. Which one am I missing? Like KT Someday, KT Arrows that Someday. Frost with Shy. They've actually played around top. They didn't play around bottom. Like, traditionally, Korea has been more around top lane play because they can play that priority. They can play that fast tempo style. They can play that flanking style, which is just harder to execute. So naturally, like, top laners It's funny how NA loves importing strong Korean carry top laners, and they make them.
They never play around them.
Yeah, like
This-
import Flame, import Huni, import Someday. Hey guys, play Cho'Gath, Shen, and Gragas, and Maokai. Like,
I mean, also playing around top is a very communication heavy style.
yeah.
And if you're going to bring in a guy who doesn't speak the language
Yes.
primarily, that's
Yeah.
just never going to work.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's on the list of NA problems. I feel like that's like 13.
Yes.
Like it's one of them, but it's not the highest.
Oh, one thing I wanted to do that's kind of special for NA is future NA beyond 2018, because I actually think there's a lot of potential and there's a lot of things to look forward to. I mean, the most obvious one is like TSM and CLG picking up their shit for 2019. I definitely think that's going to happen. I don't think either org is sitting there being like, guys, like, this year wasn't that
Well,
great.
if you think
but-
about it, that would be the cool thing, right? Because I actually said this myself at the beginning of the year. I actually thought that was the bad part about franchising, is because there was so much money, or the perception that we should all spend so much money. Almost every roster was remade, so you didn't have really any legacy rosters come in. So we didn't have, the old TSM to see how people match. You just reset the whole deck, and actually, sadly, when it came down to it, you didn't end up with loads of teams. Like in the first split, it looked like, because the deck was reset, the parity was amazing at one point in time. People might forget Team Liquid actually had to play the first round matchup. They didn't have a top seed, but you look now. Yes, it got very stratified by the summer. So as Loco's alluding to here, assuming the top teams now remain good, and then you add in some of the older franchises that have been able to create a lot of success, you could have an incredibly strong NA region.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think long term franchising will still be a boon for the North American LCS. The fact that the teams have more money and
Sure.
a lot of them building training facilities after TL's success, and more investment in coaching, more experience, all that stuff's going to work. But like, if the NALCS was the NFL and it's the only league that exists, the parity of the spring and summer split would have been amazing and celebrated, right?
Sure.
Because the best team is still the best team. But we're in this world where your regional success is secondary to your international success. So if a league really wanted to prioritize international success, like, I think league structure would be different. You actually want fewer teams because you want to compress all your best players into the top teams. And actually, if you put in 10 quality organizations all fighting against each other for all the best players, your very best teams become worse. It's just what happens.
Which is also the difference, right? Because the other thing about franchising was, now you could have a team that legitimately could be the 9th best org, and they might have the money to sign the player that TSM wanted. That's actually now possible. Whereas in the past, if you were the TSM's Cloud9s, well, you got all the players you wanted pretty much.
Yeah. So like in the short term, I think the Academy League is going to hopefully bring a few more players that were on the fringe of being pro, actually give them the reps to become good players, and that's what C9 has started to do. But like, if you actually have 10 good franchises, your top 3 teams are going to be worse than if you had 5 good franchises and 5 duds, because then the duds would just not have any good players, and you still have 5 super good teams. Just a random aside.
Yeah. I want to touch on Academy, because that's where NA failed the single most. NA, since like season 2, like this stupid idea of solo queue doesn't matter. Solo queue sucks. So we don't want to pick up from solo queue. So solo queue players are, okay, NA teams don't care about solo queue, so I'm not going to care about solo queue. And then influx of streamers coming into solo queue where, hey guys, I'm going to play AP Thresh today and Challenger Elo. Come watch me play AP Thresh. Oh my god, this guy's playing AP Thresh on my team. I don't want to fucking play solo queue. So NA solo queue gotten to a point, because it doesn't matter, people don't try hard. Because people don't try hard, it doesn't matter. And Scouting Grounds is fixing some of that. NA Academy is fixing some of that. And the point that I want to lead to is NA never got to develop its own talent because they imported so heavily. NA mids got fucked so hard because we imported Europeans and Koreans. So the NA mids that should have been given a spot and should have had the opportunity to play on stage, receive good coaching, did not get that opportunity, and then an import got it instead. So NA mids never developed. That's why NA mids suck. They don't like naturally suck. It's the one position where we never invested into the talent. And then, okay, but we had Challenger League. Why couldn't NA talent go play in Challenger League? Because Challenger League wasn't about developing NA talent. I ran a Challenger team for a year. we picked up LCS players because we weren't trying to raise players. We were trying to get into the LCS. We were get a spot into the LCS, and that's what Challenger League was for the entirety of its existence. It wasn't a place to grow players. It was a place to make money. It was a place to sell your LCS spots. So finally, we have an Academy League that's actually for developing players. Winning Academy doesn't mean anything. So the only reason you would want to have a good Academy team is to develop them. And it really showed with C9 this year. If Academy League did not exist, C9 would have not invested into Blabber. C9 would have not invested into Zazel, and those players wouldn't have came up and played. C9 wouldn't have invested into Golden Glue either. So these key players on C9, Zazel, Golden Glue, Svenskeren, Blabber, are, and to a certain regard, Licorice from United last year, wouldn't be playing on C9 today if not for Academy. So I think future of NA is, okay, we have a player that we want to replace. We don't go out and get an import. We look at the best Academy player possible, and we actually pick up the best Academy player. And once NA actually starts doing that, it took the first step in the gap actually closing.
Well, okay. If we talk about the gap, like, it's always going to be there. Mark is someone, Mark Z, who had a really good point about this. And you can see the breadcrumbs of this throughout our episode. Like, NA came into Worlds in season 2 super cocky, super arrogant because they had the game before other people and they thought they were best. Like, they came in season 1 thinking that they had the best understanding of the game because they'd won prior tournaments. Like, in season 3, teams came in overconfident. If you look at the landscape now, it's like, what are the reasons? Forget the reasons of why NA, like, what's wrong with NA, whether it's the solo queue ping or the fact that they're not giving them a chance. Like, why should they be able to beat China and Korea? Because they shouldn't be able to. Like, China has by far the most players and the most money, and Korea has by far the most infrastructure and the most discipline. So, like, those two regions should stay at the top for a while. And I do think if NA wants to overcome that, it is a mindset change, and I think that's actually happened this last year. We just haven't necessarily seen the results of it. Like, you need to figure out what your edge is going to be and come at it from that mentality of, like, we have to do something much better than China or Korea to overcome their superiority, right? Whereas previously, a lot of NA teams walked in and were like, yeah, we're just as good as Korea. Because, like, well, no, you're not. You haven't been doing esports for 2 decades, right? So that's something that could happen for NA in the future and, like, would give them a chance of pulling an upset. But I think the gap is going to be there for almost ever.
So you know what I think that edge would be? You know how we laugh at, like, Vietnam, GAM, and, like, all these teams for, like, playing random ass shit and, like, just doing things their way, and they get to upset teams better than them. What Cloud9 does, where they let the players play Kindred, I mean, I guess Kindred Jillian are more meta picks, but they let players play whatever they want. Like, Veigar support in the past, Veigar mid in the past, and they just let the players be themselves, and they aren't as restricting. In China and Korea, very, very restricted. Like, you want to play a champion? Okay, how many times have you played it in solo? Do you know this matchup? Do you know this matchup? Let's not waste our time. Let's not waste their time. Like, very structured, like, a lot of infrastructure, and you can't just randomly do stuff. In NA, we're the land of the free. Like, we might be we might be free in terms of we're free and we're easy to beat, but we're also a lot of freedom, a lot of individualism, a lot of people playing whatever they want to play. And I think that's something that NA can capitalize on, and that C9 has always done, like, letting the players be themselves and play what they want and just be more organic. I think that's where NA can actually upset better teams. Like, don't try to copy Koreans as much. Of course, like, learn basic macro. Of course, infrastructure is good. Of course, like, respecting the coach is good. But, like, give into the freedom of the players a little, and I think NA can shine a little bit more. I would love to see, like, Bjerg play, like, Zed or his Assassin champions meta. I would love to see, like, our, like, Afro play Bard, even when it's a little bit off meta, and not be so pressured into play whatever is meta, or Reddit and Twitter and your entire fan base is going to shit on you. Like, Afro, why are you being so cocky? Why are you playing Bard? This shit isn't even meta. If Afro pulled out Bard, that's what would happen.
And, Loco, if the expectations of the region change, that becomes more possible, right? Like, I actually think this is where Europe has it right in a lot of instances. They support their teams, I think, so much more than NA supports their teams. And maybe I'm just reading this wrong because like it's actually the EU people who are like since everyone speaks English and they're the ones that are actually dumping on the NA players. But like if Team Liquid makes it out of groups and goes into quarters, it should be celebrated. Like great job. Like you went to the World Championship against all these regions that potentially have advantages against you, like China with all of their players and Korea with all their infrastructure, and Europe has more players than NA as well, right? So it's like great job for like being better than them and experimenting. Like you said, if Afro pulls out Bard, instead of being flamed for like, why didn't you just try and play Tom Kench like every other Korean and Chinese team? It's like, well, because we would actually lose because of all the other things we stated in the long run. So it's a tricky road. If I was working with the team, I would try and put some of these things into practice. But like as an outside analyst, it's much easier to just shout things at teams.
We can say this, like, but to risk our jobs and say
you don't do it.
I think Afro should play Bard, and all the players looks at me, and then Afro, what are you saying? And then if things went wrong with Bard, it wouldn't be Afro that's getting the blame. It'd be the coach or the one analyst. Afro should be playing Bard. So yeah, it's really hard to speak up and go against the norm and put your job on the line. And I mean, I feel for all the NA coaches out there.
And I think for the most part, Europe celebrates their teams a lot more. Like compare the difference of G2 not making out of group stage last year with TSM not making out of essentially the same group in 2016. Like the best team in Europe versus the best team in NA failing by going 3-3 in essentially the same group. TSM was considered a failure and a laughingstock, and G2 was like, you guys did great. Like it was a hard group. No one's going to hold it against you. Like really just unlucky draw, guys. Better luck next year. Like that was, to me, the community perception, and I think that's pretty powerful.